How do you bring an MMO's story to a definitive and satisfying conclusion? It's something that doesn't really happen, what with the ongoing nature of the genre, but Final Fantasy XIV's fourth expansion, Endwalker, managed to do just that. Releasing in December 2021 to near universal acclaim, Endwalker finally brought the game's decade-long story arc to its epic conclusion. It was so incredibly popular at launch that players struggled to even get into the game due to overwhelming server traffic, and Square Enix had to temporarily stop selling the expansion while these issues were addressed. Needless to say, the hype for 14 was at an all-time high. Endwalker ended up being quite a divisive expansion due to its lackluster post-launch content, but its main scenario was as close to a perfect end to the tale of Hydaelyn and Zodiark as we could possibly have hoped for, leaving no big plot threads unresolved. It takes players to the stars and beyond, with twists and turns that I don't think anybody could have predicted. It'll likely come to no surprise to anyone who's been watching this series so far, but I loved Endwalker. It's a genuinely satisfying final chapter and an outstanding RPG in its own right, but does it top the incredible previous expansion Shadowbringers? Well, let's find out. Before we jump in, don't forget to subscribe and check out my other videos on FF14 if you haven't already, and follow me on Twitter to stay up to date with what's going on, as well as Twitch where you can catch me live in the near future. With that out of the way, let's jump right in. The final days are upon us. Let's take a look back at Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker. Our journey continues as our Warrior of Light, alongside the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, prepare to travel across the seas to the Archon's home of Sharlayan. At the Rising Stones we're briefed on current events. Mysterious towers have sprung up all across the world, brought into being by a group known as the Telophoroi, led by a nihilistic Ascian called Fandaniel, whose goal is to recreate the Final Days, a calamity which threatened the world and was halted by the summoning of Zodiark, brought about by the ancient civilization who once inhabited our planet. Countless innocents have been kidnapped and are being held within these towers, which are using their faith to summon various primals. Safe entry to the towers is impossible for most, due to a corruptive aura surrounding them, which tempers anyone who gets close, forcing them to become thralls to the Telophoroi's will. A recent meeting with Fortuno Leveilleur, a representative of Sharlayan's governing body the Forum and father to our good friends Alphino and Alisaie, resulted in Eorzea's petition for aid being rejected, with the Forum claiming it was nothing more than another petty squabble between us and Garlemald. Fortuno did, however, seem to know more than he was letting on, and so under the guise of associates of the students of Baldesion, our party sets sail to Sharlayan in search of answers. Our voyage to Sharlayan is an eventful one, as we're called out to once more by Hydaelyn, the goddess who bound Zodiark and sundered both him and our world, splitting it across the source and its 13 reflections, or shards. She's actually here in person, sort of, to remind us that the fate of our world is at stake, and that she'll honour a promise made in another time. Cryptic as ever, she vanishes as a sailor calls out to let us know we've arrived at our destination. Sharlayan is a shining seat of knowledge, known for its pursuit of scientific advancement and its notoriously stubborn neutrality. Its Greco-Roman inspired architecture is a sight to behold, with its giant statue of the nation's patron deity, Thaliak, depicting as pouring the waters of knowledge into the sea at its port. And I've got to say, that nighttime music is perfect. It's just so relaxing, I love it. So we disembark and go to check in at their immigration offices, and we're given a brief tour by Kryl and Grahartir, which introduces Endwalker's new style of escort quest. It's relatively simple. Talk to an NPC and they'll follow you around the area, which allows you to initiate conversations about your surroundings at certain spots on the map. This is a neat way of adding optional dialogue, and it sure beats the hell out of having to follow someone around who walks at a painfully slow pace. Don't worry, we'll get to that. But there's one little problem I have with it. Every single time you have an NPC follow you, it shows the same tutorial messages about them following you and how they'll reset if you leave the area. It's an admittedly minor gripe, but I think this should be optional given how frequent these are. Petty grievances aside, we head to the Baldesion Annex, the base of operations for the students of Baldesion, which serves as both our inn and a meeting room for us to discuss our plans, which are divided into two paths: an investigation into the recent behaviour of the Forum regarding the Final Days, and a request from an alchemist in the distant region of Thavnir regarding one of the Telophoroi's towers. Much like in previous expansions, we can tackle these first two questlines in any order, but because we're already in Sharlayan, it made the most sense for me to check out the local one first. The Sharlayan questline has us hitting the books in the local library and asking some of the citizens for information on the Final Days, which ends up going nowhere, but we happen to spot a group of gleaners who are rushing a bigger than usual shipment of supplies into Labyrinthos, an underground facility that serves as Sharlayan's living library of flora and fauna from across the world. The gleaners are sent all over the world to collect these supplies and answer directly to the Forum. Alisei concludes that if the Telophoro's sudden appearance prompted these larger shipments, then we might be able to get some answers in Labyrinthos, so it's off we go. So it would seem I can't escape these awful slow-paced escort quests after all. I really don't understand why the devs felt the need to include this tired old quest type everyone hates. These could have simply been replaced with the other type of escort quest we were introduced to earlier. There are parts where the NPC matches your pace, which is a godsend, but it still starts out with some painfully slow walking. It's a little frustrating to see this included, and unfortunately it gets much worse later on. After very slowly following Alisei to the lift to Labyrinthos, our group heads down to this massive underground region, complete with a false sky and sun which acts as a gigantic storage facility housing live specimens for the purpose of experimentation and research, with its lower levels still under construction and dedicated to the forum's most secretive projects. Unfortunately, our trip here suffers from the same issues that previous expansions had, where we're introduced to a new zone, briefly shown around, and then it's off elsewhere till much later in the game. That's not to say it isn't interesting, but I wish there was a little bit more to it, especially given that Thavner has a much stronger introduction and questline in my opinion. So we ask around about the recent increase in Gleaner activity, and learn that they'd been put to work on this large-scale project shortly after the Telophoroi made themselves known. Befriending a gleaner by the name of Erenville, we discover the forum might be planning some sort of mass migration, as most of the flora and fauna that the gleaners have been gathering seem to have been chosen in regards to food production. It's all his speculation at the moment however, but he does help us out in getting to one of the restricted lower levels via a mine shaft so that we might learn more. After a little bit more asking around on the middle level, we set about eavesdropping on a conversation between Erenville and one of the forum members, by having Y'shtola turn us into toads. You know, I've said it a fair few times throughout these videos, but I'm a big fan of a lot of this silliness. It's refreshing to play through a story that isn't afraid to just have fun. Not everything needs to be super serious all the time, and 14 leans more and more into its lightheartedness as we go. I'm sure it's not everyone's cup of tea, but I can appreciate a story that can make you laugh as well as cry. To me, the strongest writing is that which can elicit a wide range of emotions, and 14 nails this. So alongside Alphitoad and Alitoad, we sneak our way into earshot of the conversation, which confirms our theories. The forum is indeed making plans for the final days. We don't learn anything else about their plans at this point, and the explanation as to why sure is something, but for now we've got our confirmation at least. The whole time we've been here, Kraal's been acting rather suspiciously. First she'd been getting strong headaches that she'd been brushing off as tiredness, then she stayed behind at a patch of flowers known as heart blooms, which is said to change colour based on the emotions of whoever's nearby. Knowledge about them is rather limited due to having various different names across cultures and regions, but Kraal hands us one, claiming Hydaelyn told her that we'd need it for the journey ahead. Kraal willingly lets Hydaelyn take control of her so that she can communicate with us. It's sort of similar to how Reen channeled Binfilia back on the first, complete with the brighter eyes and everything. As for why it's Kraal, she'd always been more sensitive to Hydaelyn's calling. It's briefly touched on as far back as Heavensward, but nothing really comes of it until now. Hydaelyn's speech is as cryptic as ever, asking us to bear the light for others to follow, and letting us know that the bloom will be our guide, and in her words, test and proof of our conviction. We'll see a handful of scenes throughout the expansion where the flower changes colour to fit the emotions of ourselves and those around us, but it's not directly communicated what each colour represents, so it's kinda left to your own interpretation. Our time in Labyrinthos is up, as we're caught by Fortuno and one of the other forum members, accused of engaging in clandestine behaviour and disrupting their plans. We're dragged back to Sharlayan to stand trial in front of the 99 members of the forum, alongside Grahatir, who managed to get himself caught in the Forbidden Archives. He did dig up some information on Sharlayan's shift from gathering knowledge for the benefit of society to its current course of turning Labyrinthos into a research and archival facility though. This change coincides with the period when Sharlayan scholars began their study of the ethereal sea in the Dravanian hinterlands some 270 years ago. What they found down there has them bound to their duty, whatever it is. After the forum take turns in berating us for our actions, a much more level-headed man by the name of Monteshane manages to calm the situation, resulting in us only being banned from continuing to investigate, but still allowed to remain in the city. For now it's back outside, where we meet with the twins' mother, Emiliance Leveilleur. She's a lot happier to see her children than her husband was, and invites us to their estate, where they're both given new outfits, thankfully still not matching, and Alphino is handed his father's old weapon, a set of short staves known as Newliths, the arms of a sage. I quite like this job change for Alphino, as it shows his growth as not only a healer but as a person. The Newliths are a much more advanced weapon, and a perfect fit for someone who's been constantly trying to improve throughout the story. So it's back to the Baldessian Annex to pick up Thancred, Urianger and Estinian for our trip to Thavner. How we go about getting there is actually really interesting. If you remember back to post-ARR where we went after Iceheart, Moonbreeder helped us navigate the lifestream to reach a spot where we weren't attuned to its aetheryte. Y'shtola managed to do the same before Titan, and I'm not sure why the game doesn't bring that up here, but it is what it is. So it turns out Moonbreeder's parents were working on similar methods of travel at a research facility called the Confluence right here in Charlian. Fortunately for Urianger, who hasn't mustered up the courage to visit them yet, Moonbreeder's folks aren't in at the moment, but we're able to work as test subjects for a new method of travel that only requires aetherites to be attuned to each other, as opposed to the user being attuned to them, which saves us a lengthy trip across the sea to reach our destination. A quick trip to the Charlian aetherite and we're ready to go, minus Estinian, who's visited Thavne before and is attuned to their aetherite.
Oh, and one last thing. You might experience a teensy-weensy touch of violent ethereal sickness. Good luck!
What?
It's not a perfect method of travel.
There was a note with Kryle's instructions. Don't let Estinian roam the markets alone. He's alarmingly bad with coin.
After getting something to drink and stopping Estinian from spending far too much money on us, we see what information we can gather in the local area before meeting with the alchemist that we came here to see. One of the Telopheroi's towers stands in the distance, known locally as the Tower of Zot, and if you're an FF4 fan, you can probably guess where this is going. In fact, there's a ton of callbacks to that game throughout Endwalker, and while it's not my favourite, I love the nostalgia trip. As I've said a bunch of times now, the callbacks to the older Final Fantasy games are consistently excellent, and Endwalker keeps that tradition going strong. It manages to bring back so many of these familiar locations and characters, while also making them feel like part of 14's world as opposed to just fan service. Except maybe the Omega raids, but that's alternate dimension stuff, so I can let it slide. So as you may have guessed, the primal being summoned atop the tower isn't one entity, but three, the Mage's Sisters. But there's a nice twist to them in that their designs are clearly inspired by Hindu deities to match the Indian and Middle Eastern theme of Thavne and Radzat-Han. As I said, they took the classic character designs and made them fit in. Great stuff. So that's a nice little tease of what we'll be going up against later, but first it's off to meet with our alchemist to see what she needs help with. We reach the home of the alchemists, a place called the Great Work, to find them all suspiciously asleep. They're alarmingly quick to wake when Varshan, a young boy in service to the Satrap, the sort of ruler of Radzat-Han, arrives with a basket full of dragon scales.
Scales? We have new scales?
You can definitely admire their enthusiasm as they drag Estinian off, as they're fascinated by his fusion with Nidhogg's blood from back in Heavensward. At any rate, we meet with the leader of this enthusiastic bunch, a member of the elephant-like Matanga tribe by the name of Nidana, who has requested the Warrior of Light's assistance in testing a talisman designed to block the corruptive aura of the towers known as a warding scale. Fandaniel graces us with his presence, overlooking the experiments, as he reminisces about someone trying to create a similar device in a distant past. And for some reason while he's talking about this, his voice changes.
Another body, another time. Who could be expected to remember every trivial detail?
We'll get back to why in just a little bit. First, it's a trip to meet and share information with some of Radzat-Han's military organisation, the Radiant Host. On the way, we're introduced to yet another of Endwalker's new additions, Mounted Conversations. They're pretty standard fare in a lot of games, but this is the first time it pops up in FF14. It's fine, I guess? They're more or less a cutscene you can move the camera around in, but it's nice to sit back and take in the sights. I actually kinda wish this was an optional system for learning more about the various landmarks throughout the game, but the closest thing we've got is the Chocobo Porter system that next to nobody uses because mounts are easily accessible. Anyway, we meet with Nabdeen, who plays a sort of big brother role to Varshan, share our reports on the towers, and it's more or less straight back to the Great Work. Nidana and the alchemists reach a breakthrough thanks to our help, and the warding scales are ready for field testing. We make it to the tower safe and sound, but the rather overzealous Nidana wants us to go straight up to the entrance to truly test the scale's efficacy. Of course it doesn't end well. She's dragged inside and upon giving chase, we see Fandaniel forcing her into the wall alongside countless other Matanga. This annoying little prick is gracious enough to offer up his backstory. He inherited the position and the soul of Fandaniel of the Convocation of 14. Before then, he was just a normal man. Apparently the Sundered Asians, that is to say the ones who weren't survivors of the final days like Emmett Selg, were given the soul and memories of the ancients when they were recruited by their superiors. In his previous life, this Fandaniel was Armon, the Allagan technologist responsible for the resurrection of Emperor Zande and ancient Alag's cloning technology, among other scientific breakthroughs. This is why there was a voice change. He sort of dropped the act now he's revealed himself.
Armon, at your service.
Honestly, it's an improvement over Asahi's voice. No disrespect to Asahi's voice actor, of course, he did a great job making that little shit so annoying. We're treated to a flashback of the time before Emmett Salk recruited Armon into the Ascians, and witnessed Emperor Xande's change from Conqueror to Nihilist, shortly before making his pact with the Cloud of Darkness to have our army of creatures from the Void destroy the world, which we averted way back in ARR's Crystal Tower raids. The Armon we killed back then was just another clone, it would seem. After that revelation, we're forced to flee the tower and regroup to come up with a plan to save our new friend and the countless other prisoners. This has us taking a brief trip to Radz-at-Han, the second major city of Endwalker and one of my favourites. Everything here is just so colourful and the daytime music is incredibly catchy. Not that I had much chance to listen to it, seeing as every time I get to one of these places it's nighttime and usually raining. We meet with the Satrap, the sort of leader/advisor to the people of the city, a man named Ahawan, who is eager to help set everyone free from the tower. Estinian sees right through his facade, however.
This charade has gone on long enough. Show yourself.
Forgive me, but were you expecting musicians, perhaps?
Nay, he hath the right of it. The time for artifice is past. Raise the curtain.
It turns out that the Satrap isn't the man stood in front of us, but a dragon of the first brood, the youngest sibling of Nidhogg and Hraesvelgr, Vritra. Long story short, this was Vritra's home long before the Matanga and Al-Ra settled here, and after intervening to put an end to the conflict with invading Hjors, the dragon's governance of the state began. His position is more of an intermediary than an actual ruler, as the state is run by the people. It's the Satrap's duty to intervene when any problems arise and help reach a solution. Ahawan and his family have put on this charade of being the Satrap to keep the outside world from knowing about Vritra, to prevent any potential conflicts from happening. Oh, and that little kid Varshan is a vessel for one of the dragon's eyes, essentially serving as an inconspicuous proxy for Vritra to wander around in, which, as bonkers as it all sounds, makes for a surprisingly interesting and unique character. It's a very hands-on approach for a governing figure to take, and shows how closely involved Vritra wants to be with his people. There's a lot of potential for the concept, and it's shown off extremely well in my opinion. With that out of the way, Vritra asks us to lead the charge in assaulting the Tower of Zot to free the Matanga, with the promise of more warding scales for our allies should we succeed. The dragon scales required for their production are taken from his hide, and while it's incredibly painful for him, he's more than happy to provide them if it means his people will be safe. And so after a quick trip back to Sharlayan to regroup with our allies, it's off to the Tower of Zot we go. Our first Endwalker dungeon is a hell of a nostalgia trip. The aesthetic doesn't quite match the FF4 original, but the music's there and the Major Sisters serving as all three bosses are quite frankly excellent. It's great to see some of the other Scions making their way along separate paths at the beginning as well. It's another small detail that makes them feel like they're actually part of things. So we make our way up the tower, taking down Mindy and Sandy as our first and second bosses, before reaching the top where all three sisters fight together. Their classic signature Delta attack is here of course, as well as a great variety of different AoEs and other abilities. It's a really chaotic fight for a dungeon boss, and a great representation of the Major Sisters, even if the parts between them drag on just a little bit too long for my liking. So with the sisters out of the way, our group arrives at the tower's core, where ether is being siphoned from the land towards. Y'shtola finds something rather disturbing inside the core, a man's limb. We'll get back to the horrific implications that has in a bit. We destroy the core, causing the tower to start vanishing out of existence. G'raha manages to fire off a levitation spell just in time for everyone in the tower to survive the fall, at great cost to his own strength. Don't worry, he just needs some rest and a good meal and he'll be just fine. The people are saved, and a grateful Vritra offers us some advice about protecting our friends, and more importantly, several boxes of warding scales. Enough to arm our allies in Eorzea and the Far East so they can fend off the Telophoroi. But Y'shtola suggests the direct approach. We use them to invade Garlemald and strike at the larger tower at the Royal Palace. As everyone arranges to gather allies for the invasion, we're approached by a grateful and relieved Nidana, who notices our flower change colour to yellow. She wonders if the change is a reaction to something called Akasha, which she describes as an essence influenced by feelings. Akasha exists in a domain beyond our reach, and can't be created, destroyed, or otherwise manipulated like ether. She basically describes our limit breaks as a manifestation of this Akasha, but she admits research on the subject to be quite limited at the moment. This is another thing we'll get back to in a bit. So it's back to Sharlayan for some rest and to start planning for our long overdue trip to Garlemald. Taking some time to rest in our room, the twins, Kryl and G'raha arrive with some food, and honestly I just wanted to mention this scene for the sake of G'raha's shit-eating grin when we open the door. This is just another of those scenes where everyone gets to relax and reflect on things, and just spend time talking to each other. I will never not love scenes like this, because taking time to let the characters just be themselves makes you care so much more about them in the long run. And while we've got some free time, we're off to meet with Monteshane in a vain attempt to learn about Charlene's plans. Turns out the Forum is so secretive about their plans that they've got every member under an enchantment to block their memories of their duty, so that even if they wanted to talk about it, they couldn't, and to lift the enchantment would require the permission of 9/10 of the Forum's members. So after learning about the Forum's insane levels of security, it's time to gather our forces and march into Garlemald. Our objective is simple: deal with the Telophoroi and save any remaining Garlean citizens that we can. The bulk of Eorzean and Far Eastern forces will hold the Telophoroi at bay, while we form the Ilsabard contingent with some of the realm's finest. Everyone is here in this huge meeting, from Lys to some of the job trainers, Lucia, and even the tribes of the steppe. I will say one thing about this meeting, and I know it's a minor nitpick and it's definitely an engine limitation, but look at the background characters. They're all just posed models with no animation or even shadows. It's honestly kind of distracting, but nowhere near as distracting as Amanalane's ballroom dancing. Anyway, alongside Lucia, Maxima, Lys, the Zayla triad leaders and many more, our party makes preparations to cross the mountains leading north to Garlemald, and get some nice new warm clothes courtesy of Tataru. Crossing the mountains via airship, our Ilsabard contingent travels the rest of the way on foot, so as to not attract too much attention. This leads to what is by far one of the best solo duties in the game so far. It's this huge multi-stage battle, much like the one during the pre-Endwalker questline, and takes around 45 minutes to finish if you include the cutscenes. The first phase is a stealth mission, where we play as Thancred as he sabotages a supply depot occupied by the Telophoroi. It's surprisingly in-depth, and it has us sneaking around, silently taking out guards, throwing bombs to incapacitate the guard dogs who can sniff us out, and avoiding Imperial Magitech. Get caught and you've got a limited time to take the alerted enemies down before the mission fails. There's even a full-blown and thankfully optional tutorial for all of Thancred's abilities and the mission's mechanics. This whole thing is so well thought out and one of my favourite parts of Endwalker. Phase 2 kicks off with our convoy being ambushed by the Telophoroi on the road. This is a more straightforward battle, where we slowly push through the whole convoy, helping out the various groups as we go. It's pretty bog standard for these sorts of duties, and there's not a whole lot else to be said about it. Phase 3 is a battle in a circular arena, and has us fend off yet more tempered Imperials of Magitech, before Virgilia van Corculum, legatus of the 3rd Imperial Legion and supporter of Nerva Galvus, the cousin of the late Emperor Varys who vied for the throne during Garlemald's short-lived civil war. There's a couple of brief mentions of Nerva before now, but it's barely fleshed out, and the only time we see him is during Endwalker's role quests, which I won't be covering here much like with Shadowbringers, because they barely have an impact on the main scenario. The same goes for Virgilia as well. She turns up during the role quests, but there's not much to her either. It's a shame neither of these characters were really fleshed out, but with the Empire's collapse I'm honestly kind of okay with there being less of a focus on these characters. But this duty on a whole is still really interesting, and it's great to fight alongside so many of the friends and allies we've made along the way. So this is Garlemald, or what's left of it. It was a rather modern and industrial looking city, now in ruins with that ominous main tower off in the distance. I haven't mentioned it yet, but Emmett Selk doing the narration for these zone introductions is great, and hearing him brag about his younger days as Emperor Solus is honestly kind of endearing. It was a true pleasure to hear him again in Endwalker, and his snarky comments definitely brought a smile to my face. So while the contingent, led by Lucia, sets up camp and sorts out getting the heating back on, we head off in search of any Garlean survivors around the area. Amanalane manages to spot a survivor off in the distance, who we end up having to chase in a stealth mission. These are kinda mediocre to be honest, just hide behind rocks or trees and don't get too close. I still really like that Endwalker is adding a whole lot more to quest variety, even if the stealth missions kinda suck. It breaks up the monotony of the fetch and kill quests or just going from point A to B to watch a cutscene. There's some real effort on show here, and while these tailing missions aren't exactly wonderful, at least they're trying different things. I'm someone who values gameplay over most other aspects, and any attempts to mix things up are a welcome addition. So the girl we've been chasing is Licinia, who's part of a group of Garlean refugees holed up in an abandoned mansion for retired soldiers. This group is rather secretive and reluctant to accept our support, but we learn that they believe the radio they're listening to is the late Emperor Varys talking to them, and that he's somehow still alive. We head out to fetch some fuel from a nearby group of ceruleum tappers, but return to find Alphino attacked by the refugees, and Licinia missing along with her sick sister that they'd been hiding from us. We head out in search of the pair only to find them dead in the snow, likely killed by roaming monsters. They chose to brave the wilds rather than trust in our support. That's the state of the remaining Garleans. They think we're here to take what's left of their land and imprison them out of petty revenge, when nothing could be further from the truth. Back at camp, the tempered soldiers we fought on our way here have been cured, and we learn that they too had been hearing Emperor Varys giving them orders in their dreams. May the Tower of Babel stand as testament to the glory of Garlemald. Yup, this is the FF4 expansion alright. And it turns out these radios contain an ore comprised of similar ether to that of the warding scales, meaning that these radios are all that's stopping the Garleans in the region from being tempered. An interesting coincidence to say the least. We're interrupted by Cyrena, who tells us a Garlean soldier was caught trying to steal our supplies. This is Julius, and if you thought the refugees hated us, this guy is much worse. He extends an invitation for us to speak with his commander, but only lets 3 of us come with him. So alongside the twins, we follow him back to a subway station where the remnants of the 1st Imperial Legion are hiding out. Their commander, Quintus, is just as stubborn as the rest, going as far as to place shock collars on the twins in case any of us does anything out of line. The 1st is planning to join forces with the 10th Legion and storm the Tower of Babel, and we're off to lend them a hand in procuring supplies and the like, not that we have much of a choice. So we're kinda stuck here doing a bunch of menial tasks of the 1st Legion, and honestly this whole stretch has been fairly dull. It's a bunch of following quests and fetch quests with a group of really unlikable characters barking orders at us, while they frustratingly refuse to believe we're here to help. It's hard to feel sorry for them after the Empire fell when they treat us so horribly, but thankfully this doesn't go on for too much longer. With Julius in charge of watching us, we help the 1st gather fuel from the ruins of the city, while hearing about how he mourns its downfall. It's not long before Thancred catches up to us, somehow completely invisible, and lets us know that Lucia had us followed. We're instructed to keep doing as the Garleans say for the time being, and Thancred... does he leave or does he just stay here? It's hard to tell. At any rate, we gather the fuel and head back to the station, where Quintus orders his soldiers to get their Magitech armour up and running, claiming that now is the time for action. It's a setup. The twins are being kept as prisoners while the 1st assault our camp to take our supplies and have us withdraw from Garlean soil. Of course, the contingent is one step ahead of them. Estinian arrives to free the twins, and Lucia delivers the news to Julius that the remnants of the 10th Legion, having failed to coordinate efforts to reclaim the capital with the other Imperial legions, arrived in Alamigo to ask for Eorzean assistance. Listening into the conversation, Quintus relieves his soldiers from their duty, loads his gun, and I'll let you figure the rest out. We offer shelter to the remaining Garlean soldiers and settle in at camp for the night. It's a wholesome little scene where members of our contingent bicker among themselves about who set up the heaters and whatnot, while an Alamigan ex-conscript offers the olive branch to Julius in the form of a nice warm soup. But our little celebration ends up cut short by the scream of a primal coming from the Tower of Babel, tempering the soldiers who inexplicably weren't given spare warding scales and plunging our camp into chaos. But before we can help, Fandaniel shows up in disguise to whisk us away to meet with his lord.
Save me, brave hero! Ahem. My lord has requested your presence, and I would hate to disappoint him. Now, it is time for you to awaken.
Well, I certainly didn't expect a date with Xenos to be on the cards, but here we are. But it's not the Warrior of Light sat across from Xenos. We've been forced into the body of a random Imperial soldier. Fandaniel used some of that engineer we killed in Alamigo's research to drag us out of our own body and into this Imperial's. During our very awkward dinner, Fandaniel explains that the primal atop the Tower of Babel was manifested by the will of the Garlean people crying out for salvation, channeled through the corpse of the late Emperor Varys, creating their primal anima. Remember that limb in the Tower of Zot's core? Well, it's pretty heavily implied that it belonged to Varys, as the other towers were all created as an extension of anima. It's actually a great nod to the faith from Final Fantasy X, rather than just a gross thing where the dude's body is chopped into pieces. To quickly summarise what's going on in FF10, the faith are these statues that house a willingly given human soul, and when a summoner prays at one of these statues during their pilgrimage, the soul bonds with them, granting them the ability to summon Aeons, such as Ifrit, Shiva, and later our friend Anima here. I'm oversimplifying for the sake of being brief, but you guys should totally play Final Fantasy X. It's one of my favourites and it still holds up remarkably well, thanks to its solid presentation, quick turn-based combat, and the still excellent sphere grid levelling system. Story's a bit on the simplistic side compared to 14, but it's by no means bad and offers its fair share of great emotional moments. Consider that my sort of mini review and hearty recommendation. Okay, tangent over, back to our awkward dinner date. Our misfortune isn't over just yet, as Xenos decides to take our body for a spin. Fandaniel oh so graciously lets us outside, and we've got to rush through the ruins of Garlemald to get back to our allies before Xenos gets to them. This is another surprising and really fun solo duty. We've got 35 minutes to sneak our way through hostile territory with tempered Imperials all over the place. We need to scavenge healing kits to stay alive and have very limited combat capabilities. This is the only time having such a small selection of skills makes sense in these battles, and it makes for a really tense encounter. I'm not quite sure what this expansion's obsession with stealth mechanics is, but it's more new gameplay variety and I'm all for it. As we make our way through the streets, we come across a dying Imperial, who gives us his identification key that we can use on some nearby Magitech armour to clear a path. The only problem is we need to search for fuel. It's relatively simple and results in what is essentially a turret section where we clear out wave after wave of Magitech before moving forward and assisting more Imperial citizens against monsters and tempered Imperials. We're then caught in an explosion and forced to slowly crawl the rest of the way. That last bit is obviously pretty sluggish, but overall it's a great solo duty. These are much more spread out compared to earlier expansions, but pretty much since Stormblood, the solo duties have really started to become a hell of a lot more than simple instance battles. There's a ton of unique gameplay moments in these, and they're a welcome change of pace from the standard dungeons and trials. Great stuff overall, honestly. Xenos beats us to the camp, but the Scions are thankfully smart enough to see right through him. Just as he attacks, we catch up and manage to stop him by throwing the Imperial sword at his Reaper avatar and tackling him to the ground. Fandaniel arrives to let us know that the effect has run its course and it's back to our own body we go. He also admits to being behind all of the little diversions we've had to deal with, slowing our progress while the Tower of Babel amassed enough ether to reawaken Zodiark and bring about the final days. Despite it all, I love this section with the body swapping and the awkward dinner and everything. The slow build up throughout Garlemald actually paid off, and honestly in the grand scheme of things, it's another pretty minor gripe of mine. It feels like that section in Armor Reng towards the end of base Shadowbringers that I wasn't a fan of. It's slow, pretty tedious, but it doesn't drag the whole experience down by any stretch, and it's straight uphill from here on out, as we'll soon see. So we get our body back, shake off the cobwebs, feel a little dirty for having had Xenos inside of us, let our companions know about Anima, and it's finally time for the assault on the Tower of Babel. Most of the troops set out to create diversions across the city, while we head to the tower via a nearby freight tunnel. Given the choice between all 7 of the Scions accompanying us as our duty support NPCs, the most so far, it's time for our second dungeon. Despite this version of the Tower of Babel bearing virtually no resemblance to the FF4 original, it's still got some great moments. We start out on a train making our way to the base of the tower, fending off Magitech alongside our pretty large group of allies, but we eventually split up to head through different paths. Ours takes us to Barnabas, the robotic creation of the Mad Dr. Luge, both of whom will immediately be familiar to FF4 fans. It's a pretty solid fight and yet another great callback. Luge himself shows up as the second boss, having implanted his own brain into a mechanical body to enact his revenge on us for killing Barnabas. Yeah, the lore for this guy is kinda wild. Our final boss is, of course, Anima. I know a fair portion of the 14 community wasn't particularly happy with Anima being a dungeon boss and not its own trial, but I still really enjoyed this fight. It's another spot-on recreation of a classic summon and has this great second phase where we're sucked into Anima's dimension, which culminates with Anima's signature attack, Oblivion. Despite us taking Anima down, the tower managed to amass enough ether for Fandaniel to enact his plan. He uses the tower to try and break the barrier surrounding the moon, where Zodiark's prison is located. Hydaelyn intervenes, possessing Kryl again to stop him, and the tower runs out of ether, but that's no big deal for Fandaniel, as the Tower of Babel happens to serve as a teleporter to the moon itself. And you know what, I'd call this ridiculous, but it's not like this is the first time a Final Fantasy game has us go to the moon. Or other dimensions for that matter. Or time travel. Yeah, Final Fantasy's always been kinda weird, hasn't it? At any rate, Fandaniel and Xenos head to the moon to break the barrier themselves, and Hydaelyn manages to knock them off course. While the tempered outside are wreaking havoc, our party stays behind to deal with them and we give chase, using the teleporter ourselves and arriving on the moon at a site called Mare Lamentorum. Okay, so the moon was created by Hydaelyn as a prison for Zodiark, similar to how the Allagans created Dalamud much later. The prison is protected by 6 seals, or brands, 5 of which were broken when Fandaniel used the Tower of Babel. As we arrive at Mare Lamentorum, we're called out to by a figure resembling one of the Ancients, known as the Watcher. This Watcher is responsible for overseeing and maintaining the seals, preventing Zodiark's escape, and informs us that he's restoring one of the broken 5, but is being kept from repairing the rest due to the souls of Zodiark's summoners working against him, and we're tasked with approaching these souls to see what we can do to help. As we talk to the souls, they slowly fade away, and after the last one vanishes from the first brand, a spectral dog appears to guide us around the rest. At the end of this trail, while surrounded by ancient souls lamenting the loss of their once perfect world, a familiar soul greets us, Hydaelyn. Now this isn't the version we met in Amarot of course, but rather the real thing. He immediately recognises the soul of Azam, pretty much confirming that the Warrior of Light is, in fact, the reincarnation of the ancient whose crystal was given to us. He places his faith in us, knowing that Emmett Selk meant for us to bear Azam's crystal, and spots Fandaniel arriving alongside Xenos and destroying the 5th brand. Hydaelyn ensures that the Ancient's shades won't bother us anymore, and sends us, his new old friend, to protect the final brand. We don't make it in time. Fortunately for us, Zodiark doesn't instantly spring out of his prison due to the loss of Elidibus, his heart and will, and while Xenos challenges us to another battle, Fandaniel throws himself into the prison, awakening the oldest and most powerful of primals.
Do you remember when I told you that I wanted to die and take everyone with me? I meant it.
With all of the ancient souls crying out for the world's salvation, Fandaniel silences them, and a familiar ancient appears to encourage us to let the light of our souls shine for all to see. Clutching Azam's crystal, we prepare for the showdown with Zodiark, now possessed and under the control of Fandaniel. This was so unexpected. By this point we're only level 83 and still have more than half of the expansion left to play through. Everyone assumed Zodiark to be the final boss, but as shocking as it is, this is classic Final Fantasy. We can't have an ending without a bigger, more evil enemy behind the one we'd been preparing to face all game after all. I'll fully admit I suck at this trial. It's that one mechanic where the platform rotates that always messes me up. And it messed everyone else up too, because our party actually wiped on it, with me somehow being the last one left at 55%. The second attempt went much more smoothly, thankfully. Still, it's a great trial with lots of interesting attacks going off to keep you on your toes, and a transformation into the second phase where Zodiark's mask comes off to reveal his very ugly and demonic looking face. How the Ancients ever thought this was their saviour is beyond me. As per usual, the music is phenomenal. I don't talk about music enough in these videos, but I swear it gets better every expansion. After the battle, Fandaniel reveals his true plan. He wanted us to kill Zodiark, because he was all that stood between our world and the final days. With the wisdom of 10,000 years, he sees no value in our existence, as he fades away with the knowledge that all will be returned to nothingness, as was the will of Emperor Xande. With Zodiark's death, the souls of all those who summoned him are finally able to return to the planet and be at peace at long last. Making our way back to the moon's surface, we hear a voice and see a vision of the planet's demise.
At last.
But what about Xenos? Well, he realises we've no interest in fighting him because we've got a world to save, so he just up and leaves again, in search of power beyond that of Shinryu to fuel our rage for the inevitable final battle. He sees us as nothing more than a ravenous beast itching for that next big challenge, and while we do rise to the occasion when needed, we're a lot more than that and he can't see beyond it. Okay, so this is long overdue, but what's going on with Xenos really? Back in Stormblood he was supposed to be this brilliant general who conquered Doma with ease, and turned into this irredeemable monster who would kill whoever and do whatever he wanted just for the sake of finding some sort of big adrenaline rush from someone who could truly challenge his might, caring about nothing but the next big battle. But ever since we beat him and he went through those body swapping shenanigans, it feels like he's been relegated to a henchman to Fandaniel. He doesn't really make me care about fighting him again, and there's not really anything about his actions that make me think, ah yes, only Xenos is capable of doing something like that. You could have anyone else kill Varus and stop Black Rose production, and have Fandaniel do most of the work on the towers himself, and it'd barely make a difference. Xenos is just there for the sake of some grand final battle, but the problem is he's insignificant. We already beat him, he's beneath us. And he just keeps following us around like a lost puppy and making excuse after excuse to not just get it over with. I don't care about any of it, and in my eyes he's a failed attempt at this rival type character. At any rate, we've got to figure out what to do about the coming calamity. With Y'shtola, Thancred and Urianger arriving on the moon, we learn a little more about the final days from the Watcher. Our world's original name was Etheris, so thank God we've got a better name to call it than Hydaelyn, because that was confusing, and the final days were set into motion by a terrible cry coming from within the earth, which caused some sort of change in all manner of life. The ancients' creation magics ran rampant, giving shape to their thoughts of despair. It started in a single region at first, but quickly spread to engulf the entire planet. The ancients never found the source of it, but they did manage to come up with a method to predict where the corruption would manifest next. This requires a bit of an explanation on how ether works. Its energies flow through all of creation in the form of various currents, the ones which flow through the land and the seas, the ones that flow through the air, and finally those of a celestial nature encompassing the planet and its moon. These celestial currents are inconsistent, and it's where they were weakest that the corruption occurred, with a stagnation of each region's ether. Zodiark was conceived to harness the forces of darkness, those of activity and growth, in order to quicken the flow of ether and prevent further stagnation. Understanding that the preservation of the natural order was reliant on Zodiark's existence, Hydaelyn was brought forth not to destroy him, but to keep him confined. So she sundered Zodiark, herself, and the planet into lesser reflections to keep him here on the moon. Thancred then poses a simple question. What would happen to the reflections if the source was consumed by the final days? The Watcher's answer is pretty much what you'd expect. Bring ruin to the source, and its reflections will share in its fate. And just as we get our answer, we're interrupted by a rumbling, indicating that Hydaelyn's contingency plan is ready. To put it simply, this is no moon, it's a spaceship. I've got a bad feeling about this. The moon is designed to take the people of Etheris to safety, should the planet fall to the final days, and the Watcher invites us to meet its pilots, so we hop on our canine companion Argos and arrive at Bestway's Burrow. Remember when I said this is the Final Fantasy IV expansion? Well... The pilots of our moonship are 14's version of the Hummingways, the rabbit-like creatures who lived on FF4's moon. These ones are called Loperites, and they are 100% Endwalker's comic relief. And as silly as all of this is, it's par for the course. None of what's happened in the last hour or so of the game is out of the ordinary for Final Fantasy. I'm sure if this is your first game in the series, a lot of what's going on will feel out of place, much like that weird vocal minority of the community who seem to think Dawntrail Solution 9 doesn't fit in. But it's very typical of the series, even from the very first game. Personally, I rolled my eyes and smiled at the callback here. We meet with the leader of this adorable little bunch, Livingway, the self-proclaimed right paw of Hydaelyn, who explains the moon's purpose. The Loperites have been gathering as many resources and supplies as they can to carry the people of Etheris to another world. Mappingway, the navigator, as its name would suggest, tells us that they've identified a few promising worlds already, so the plan is to go down their list until we find a suitable new home. Most importantly, they've been working with some of the denizens of Etheris for quite some time, procuring supplies and learning about our world's inhabitants. It's fairly obvious who they are, let's be honest. So after being given the tour, which involved tasting some of their food, which is exclusively carrots by the way, and trying on some less than stylish outfits, Urianger gets dragged off and is once again up to no good. We sneak our way after him in another one of those dumb little stealth missions, and he finally starts to open up about all of the previous times he's kept things from us, as well as his regret for Moonbreeder's loss. It's the first time he properly lets his guard down around us and shows his softer side. He's a kind and gentle soul under all of the deception and secrecy, and our time on the moon really gave me a whole new respect for him.
To dispense with all pretense and bare one's heart to another is a frightening thing indeed. But we cannot move forward ere we take that bold first step. A lesson I have learned many times before. And today.
What are they saying? Curse these ears and her buggerall!
Needless to say, there's something suspicious about these Loperites, and it's clear they've been giving us the runaround this whole time. They want to make sure we don't interfere with their plans to take everyone from Etheris to a whole new world, seeing our intentions to use the moon only as a last resort as too great of a risk, and even going as far as to attack us to try and force us to stay here. So about what they asked Urianger to do then. They're sending him back to Etheris to work with their allies in preparing for their journey to the moon and beyond. He doesn't go along with it, and he once again proves the kind soul he is as he tries to convince the Loperites to stand down and give us time to find a better solution. Our flower once again changes colour, prompting the Watcher to question where we got it from. He refers to it as Elpis, and says that we'd do well to remember the name. Urianger stays behind with the Loporrits to ensure that their preparations go smoothly, while the rest of us head back to Etheirys to seek out their not-so-mysterious benefactors, you guessed it, the Sharlayan Forum. Back in Garlemald, the situation with the Tempered has calmed down, with many of them in custody awaiting treatment. After Anima's defeat, all of the towers, minus Babel, have vanished, and finally the 10th Legion has denounced Xenos, condemning his role in the Empire's downfall and declaring him Xenos Viator Galvus, outcast and enemy of Garlemald. With everyone caught up on what's been happening, our party heads back to Sharlayan. While we catch up with everyone at the Baldessian Annex, we find out that the Forum has called a public assembly to reveal the truth to the citizens of Sharlayan. Their enchantment is lifted and they're able to speak of their duty. When their scholars set out about finding a way to access the Ethereal Sea, they discovered the heart of the planet, and Hydaelyn herself. All that increased Gleaner activity at Labyrinthos was, of course, the Forum preparing for the journey to the moon. Fortuno is now at the helm of this operation, and the twins finally come to the realization that he started pouring his heart into his work after they were born, not for his benefit, but for theirs. And despite that knowledge, no amount of trying to convince him that there could be another way out of this can change his attitude of do what you will but stay out of our way. Back at our inn room, we have a visitor. We're actually given a choice out of all of the 6 scions who are with us, and whichever one we pick is the one knocking on our door. It's actually a nice little bit of player choice and lets you spend time with whoever your favourite scion is. It should come as no surprise that I picked Alisei, but I did go back to check out the other choices via the Unending Journey at the inn room, which lets you rewatch the cutscenes. They're all largely similar, each scion voices their concerns about recent events and asks us to take care of ourselves. They just want someone to help them get things off their chests, and it's a nice series of scenes that unfortunately you only get to see one of, unless you do what I did and rewatch the cutscenes. Meanwhile, we see citizens in both Alamigo and Ishgard starting to show signs of some sort of change, and we see Thavner succumbing to the stagnancy of the celestial current, indicating that the final days are already upon us. And when we wake, Kral informs us that vile beasts have appeared out of nowhere, and that the skies above Thavner and Rads at Han are burning.
And lo, vile beasts did rise.
Arriving in Thavner, we confirm it for ourselves. Red skies, fire falling from the heavens, and creatures resembling the ones we fought back in Emmett Selk's recreation of Amarot are everywhere. We learn from Ahewan that the people are being transformed into these beasts, the strongest of which have been referred to as blasphemies by the people of Rads at Han, owing to their superficial resemblance to divinities of legend. We're tasked with hunting down one of these blasphemies by fighting our way through a dense jungle called Vanaspati, which serves as our next dungeon. Honestly, I like this dungeon way more than I remember. Witnessing these transformations happening right in front of us is a horrifying glimpse into the future of the world. The bosses are all great too, with a nice variety of attacks, like the first boss's weird mouths on the floor where you have to avoid the open ones. They look really dumb, but I kinda love these sorts of quirky designs. And the blasphemy itself is another fun encounter. Most of its mechanics are simple opposites, just stand on the part of the ground that doesn't match the on-screen symbol, but there's this really cool phase where you have to watch the skies for falling meteors. It's not the first time we've had to look outside the arena to figure out where attacks are coming from, but it's definitely one of the more interesting times this happens. So we kill the blasphemy and Y'shtola realises the terrifying truth about them. There was no ether there. When these people transform, their ether begins to rot and crumble away. They can't be saved once the transformation has happened, because there's almost immediately nothing left to save. While Estinian joins Vritra in the skies, the rest of us regroup with Ahewan back at Rads at Han, where we learn that the blasphemy we just killed was a merchant by the name of Karl Zal, who we very briefly met on our first visit to Thavner while we were asking around about the tower. Apparently he was worried about his business failing, which is what led to his feelings of despair that brought about the transformation. The rest of our party learned that similar such feelings were observed in all of the others who transformed, including those who saw loved ones killed or transformed right in front of them, causing a chain reaction of transformations. The final days is basically causing everyone's darkest feelings to consume and warp them into these abominations. Not only that, but this Karl Zal's transformation happened before the skies started to burn, meaning that there's no sign of the final days approaching. Anyone, anywhere could potentially transform at any moment. Another person we met on our first trip to Thavner, a Matanga by the name of Matsia, arrived to ask for help at the nearby settlement of Palaka's Stand, which is being overrun by these beasts. One of the citizens of Radzat-Han, a woman worried about her grandson, starts to get hysterical and transforms right in front of us, prompting other nearby citizens to transform as well.
Get away from her, now!
Our party scrambles to defend everyone, but we're not quick enough. Hydaelyn is eaten by one of the monsters, and we desperately try to prevent more transformations. G'raha takes charge of the situation, while Thancred sends us and the twins off to Palaka's stand to try and save as many of its people as we can. This whole stretch is tense, horrifying, and does an outstanding job of showing how truly hopeless the world is against this threat. We fight our way through more of these monsters, but we're too late to save everyone. Only a handful of the villagers remain, with one couple and their newborn child missing in the wilderness somewhere. We make it to the father only to find him mortally wounded. Doing what we can to comfort him, we prevent his transformation as he dies right in front of us. After killing more of the beasts and saving a group of scared villagers, Alphino helps with the wounded, while Matsuya calms them by reciting an old prayer. He's someone who's easily upset, and recites the words over and over to calm himself. Spotting someone being chased by one of the beasts, we find out it's the mother and child we've been looking for. She dives into the water to flee for her life, and while the twins take care of the monster, we dive in after her, only to find her already dead and the baby barely clinging to life. More monsters surround us, and we give the child to Matsuya to take back to the village while we fend them off. Desperate and terrified, he continues to recite those calming words while yet more beasts surround him.
Do not avert your eyes. See your life for what it is. See how the hardships make you strong. Every doubt reforged.
I don't think words can do justice to this scene. I was on the edge of my seat the entire time I played through the first time, really wanting him to make it to safety. For such a minor character, I was thoroughly invested in rooting for him. That's how good of a job the game does of showing how overwhelmingly hopeless the situation is. As I said, this whole stretch is fantastic. Thankfully, Vritra and Estinian arrive to save the day. The baby even takes a liking to our dragon friend, and calms down quite quickly in his presence. With the beasts pushed back and what few villagers remain saved, we return to Radzat-Han, where Vritra finally reveals the truth to his people about him being the satrap, a wish that Hydaelyn expressed to him before his death. Everyone's thankfully okay with it, but we're interrupted by Fortuno and a handful of forum members who are going around the world to offer everyone an escape from the final days aboard the moon. While they engage in talks with Vritra, Nidana comes rushing up to us with a theory. If the beasts these people have transformed into are drained of their ether, what is it that's keeping them alive? She believes it to be this Akasha she told us about earlier, the unseen force driven by emotion. She asks to see our flower, which fades away right as we take it out. The negative emotions in the air were so powerful that the flower was suffocated and faded away. That's a little something to bear in mind for later. With so little information to go on, our party is at a loss as to what to do. Our only hope is Hydaelyn herself, but she either can't or won't speak to us, but we're reminded of the Watcher's description of the flower Hydaelyn gave us. In their time, it was called Elpis. We don't have any living ancients to ask about it, but G'raha pipes up, realising that Elidibus is still trapped within the crystal tower on the First. His ether is slowly being returned to the ethereal sea, but if there's some remnant of his soul still in there, we could ask him for help. So while the rest of the Scions set about doing what they can to help those on the source, we make another trip back to the First in search of answers. We arrive in Lakeland and seek out Lena, who's still holding onto the key to the Umbilicus, the private study at the top of the crystal tower. While she fetches it, we run into some of our old friends in the Crystarium. First up are Moran and Beck Lug, who are chronicling the events from the Flood of Light to the return of the night sky across Norvrent. Moran asks us about our greatest enemies from the First, before the pair head off to Yulmore to collect some documents. Next are the three children we briefly helped on their first steps as new adventurers. One of them is struggling with which weapon to take up, and we're allowed to offer him advice on which one to pick. I chose the sword because their party was desperately in need of a tank. Well, actually it was more because the option said to protect your friends, which fit pretty well. I'm sure most people chose that option, to be honest. Finally, we're reminded how cold and cruel and heartless we are by Feo Ul for not calling out to them sooner. They can't offer us any help, unfortunately, but I guess it's nice to see the Pixie King again. Once we're done catching up with our old friends, Lena arrives with the key, as well as Reen, who's been having premonitions about the final days. It's great to catch up with everyone and see how the first is getting on, but unfortunately we've got more important things to worry about now. So it's up the tower we go, where we come face to face with Elidibus. He's still dedicated to his duty and shares some memories of the convocation with us. As we know, the stagnation of the ether began where the planet's celestial currents were the weakest, as the Fandaniel of old had discovered. He dedicated himself to finding a countermeasure, and if not for his knowledge of the celestial currents, the ancients would never have stalled the final days. This Elpis that the Watcher told us about was actually an ancient testing facility for deciding which of their creations were fit to be released into the world, and before joining the convocation, the ancient Fandaniel was their chief, a man named Hermes. Unfortunately, no ruins of Elpis survived, but Elidibus somehow remembers seeing us there, and realises that we're meant to travel back in time to the World Unsundered and visit Elpis ourselves. Given the amount of time we'd have to travel to, the gateway won't be fully formed, so our form will likely be intangible, making it impossible for anyone to see us. And even if we could interact with others, we can't make any form of meaningful change, because the reality we're trying to save only exists as a result of the final days. So let me get this straight. G'rahatia travelled back in time to prevent the 8th Umbral Calamity from happening, succeeded, and exists in our reality, but for us to travel to the first, he would have needed to travel back in our reality, but because there's no reason for him to do so, we should be in a separate reality entirely? So wouldn't that mean the one we were trying to save in Shadowbringers actually ended up getting hit with the Calamity? And now we're going back to the past and can't change things because we need to come back to the same reality we left in? I think this is one of those things we're not supposed to think too much about. So Elidibus uses the last of his strength to send us back thousands of years to the time before the Sundering, when Aetheris was one world, and to the ancients' testing facility of Elpis. As we were warned, we're barely visible, and we can't interact with anyone or anything. That is, until a familiar pair of visitors to the facility arrive and manage to spot us thanks to their ability to perceive souls.
Come now, is this truly necessary? Surely you can tell who we are.
We're greeted and given tangible form by none other than Emet-Selch and Hythlodaeus. Our old nemesis is just as snarky as ever and very reluctant to help us, but Hythlodaeus is almost his complete opposite, a much kinder, gentler person who is more than happy to help us in our search for Hermes, who, conveniently for us, is exactly the man they came here to see. We find him with relative ease, accompanied by a creation of his called Meteion.
Different. You're different too. You and me. We're alike. Friends. I want to be...
This winged little girl has trouble speaking normally, but manages to communicate with us telepathically. She's described by Hermes as a pet project of his which is still undergoing preliminary testing. As for Hermes himself, he seems a kind and gentle person who cares deeply for all of his creations. As Meteion's taken a liking to us, Hermes lets us join in on his meeting with Emet-Selch. Their meeting is about how the current Fandaniel, who was in charge of Elpis before Hermes, has stepped down and named Hermes as his preferred successor. As Emet-Selch doesn't know Hermes personally, he's here as an impartial party to determine his value to the convocation. Hermes is troubled by this news, as it means that the former Fandaniel will be returning to the star. You see, the ancients were all but immortal, and stepping down from one's duty meant willingly choosing to die and have their soul return to the ethereal sea. They believe man's duty is to make the world a better place, so that everyone can live in happiness. They see death and their return to the star as a privilege and a beautiful journey. Hermes is clearly uncomfortable with his predecessor and friend choosing to end it all. This upsets Meteion, and we're asked to keep her company for a bit while everyone else finishes their meeting. While we're taking her out for a walk around the area, we learn that Meteion's telepathy is actually her converting her emotions into words and intention and projecting them onto others, which is vital to her mission because it allows her to interact with other intelligent life forms that she might not otherwise be able to. A consequence of having this power is her rather clumsy speech. Now that the meeting's over, Hermes offers to let us accompany him while he deals with a few duties around Elpis. It's here we come across the same flower Hydaelyn gave us, known here as an Elpis flower. Hermes describes it exactly like Nidana. It reacts to the emotional state of those around it, influenced by an energy different to ether which he refers to as dynamis, which is much weaker than ether, and under normal circumstances, its effects are drowned out. And because our ether is weaker than that of the ancients, we're more susceptible to the effects of dynamis. So we continue our trip around Elpis while Hermes attends to various tasks, and find a group of creatures that had been killed by another more aggressive species, which one of the researchers believes isn't worthy of being sent out into the world. Questioning whether it's just an isolated incident, Hermes is told that even using Kairos to start with a fresh slate, the creature's behaviour was still the same. This Kairos that's mentioned is a memory reconfiguration system created by Hermes, which basically allows the user to wipe or change memories so that they can observe their creations in different environmental conditions, without needing to remake them from scratch. Valuing life as much as he does, Hermes sees this as a better alternative than simply killing the creature off. As Meteion tells us shortly after, Hermes is in a pretty dark place, and has been since before she was created. She wants him to know that he isn't alone, so she asks us to use our pain and sorrow to change the colour of a group of Elpis flowers in front of Hermes, so he can realise that he's not the only one who's known suffering. It's a powerful moment about helping people you care about when they're down, and as someone with mental health issues, it's one of Endwalker's most poignant moments. Sometimes all you need is to know you're not alone, and this scene conveys that wonderfully. Hermes opens up about how he feels, and how he's plagued with doubt about his duty to the world. He laments about how creations deemed useless are discarded without a second thought, and how despite their efforts to spare them of the pain, they cower in fear, and Hermes hates how everyone turns a blind eye and carries on in blissful ignorance. He thanks us for simply being there and showing that he's not the only one to experience suffering and sadness, and explains that he created beings of Dynamis, Meteion and her many sisters, to traverse the stars in search of life, and to find out what gives these other beings' lives meaning. A short while later, we help round up some of those rogue creatures and kill them so that they won't harm the others. Instead of calmly explaining how he feels this time, Hermes snaps, venting his frustrations about so many pointless deaths, and how he hates the idea of him joining the convocation basically meaning him approving of his predecessor's death. After his outburst, Hermes leaves to collect his thoughts while the rest of us tend to the other creatures. We run into a new species of bipedal shark, and while Hydaelyn goes on a lengthy ramble about how popular sharks are in Elpis, another familiar ancient swoops down to save us from being attacked by it.
That was too close. Are you unharmed?
This is Venar, the woman who eventually became the heart of Hydaelyn. Venar used to be a member of the Convocation, and is one of the few who didn't lay down her life after leaving, opting instead to continue with her work, but her seat on the Convocation just so happened to be Azem. Just to clear things up, it's actually her successor's soul that was reincarnated into the Warrior of Light. Venar almost immediately realises we've come from the future, as she recognises her magic on us. It turns out that Hydaelyn's Blessing of Light is a simple traveller's ward that prevents the corruption of one's ether. I'm almost disappointed it has such a simple explanation, to be honest, but what's important is Venar sees it as her future self clearly marking us for her to recognise when we're sent into the past, which begs all sorts of questions about what Hydaelyn actually knows and hasn't told us. We're asked to tell our story, but we're obviously reluctant to do so out of fear of changing things in the past and affecting our future, but Emet-Selch is rather demanding towards us, so we end up agreeing to it. They're more than a little sceptical about our tale, with Emet-Selch outright dismissing it, refusing to believe any of what we told him about his future self, but deep down he's scared of becoming that person and meeting such an end. With what limited information we have available to us, we set about learning more about Hermes. Unfortunately, we don't learn a great deal, other than that he would never willingly set about such a calamity as the final days. We do, however, learn that he sent off countless other meteor to visit other worlds, as he alluded to earlier. We track down the spot where he sent them off so that Venar can help us see into the past through ripples left in the ether, much like how we use the Echo. Our destination is a small floating island off in the distance, and we don't have a method of flight in Elpis, so Venar summons Argos, the dog who helped us on the moon. But even though we remember him from the future, he's reluctant to help a stranger. This leads Venar to challenge us to a sparring match in order to prove ourselves worthy of Argos' trust. Finally some action! I know a lot of this section has been a case of, so this happened, and then this happened, but that's virtually all Elpis is until now, glorified exposition. Not to say that's bad, not at all, it's quite the opposite. I find the ancients' way of life and their views on death fascinating, and Hermes feeling like this odd one out who unintentionally causes the final days because he can't come to terms with throwing away so many lives is genuinely tragic. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. So the fight with Venar is pretty solid. Nothing revolutionary, but it's a nice duel that comes along at just the right time to break up some of the monotony. Naturally, we prove ourselves worthy, and Argos takes us over to that distant island where we see what Hermes and Meteion are really up to. As I said a minute ago, all of Meteion's sisters have been sent to distant planets to survey other life forms and find out what gives their lives meaning. They report back to the Meteion in Elpis via a shared consciousness network, and in this flashback, they're well on their way to their respective worlds. Hermes is optimistic about the project, and definitely doesn't seem like the kind of person who would intentionally cause the final days, much like we'd learned before. In light of this, Venar suggests we reveal our story to him, in the hope that he might join us in our search for a solution to it. So we reunite with Hythlodaeus and Emet-Selch and set about tracking Hermes down again. We tell him our tale and he points out one key difference between their final days and ours. Theirs affected their creation magics, while ours is affecting the people themselves. Seeing as our etheric density is much lower than the ancients due to the sundering, our people are more susceptible to the influence of Dynamis, but that's the cause, not the source. All he can do is speculate, but Hermes believes that because Dynamis is an energy put into motion by feelings, these feelings have to be coming from somewhere, or someone. And with a little bit of convenient timing, Meteion reconnects to her sister's shared consciousness, and the intense feelings of pain and suffering she's receiving overwhelm her, and she vanishes out of sheer terror, wanting to hide her report from Hermes.
Connection established. Commencing status report.
It hurts! It hurts! Why do we... They hurt! Hate! This is wrong! All wrong!
It's safe to say we found our culprit. So we chase her down, and despite her attempts to lose us, Hermes asks to hear her report, whether it's good or bad. All of her sisters arrived at their respective destinations, attempted to make contact with the inhabitants of each world, and reported their grim findings. Every world was completely devoid of life, or close to it, having been wiped out by plague, war, or environmental disasters. Upon hearing these findings, Emet-Selch demands Meteion be taken to Amarot so the ancients can find and bring her sisters back. Hermes, dedicated to his mission and refusing to comply, transforms right in front of us and carries Meteion away so that she can finish her report. Giving chase, we end up at Elpis' most advanced research facility and our next dungeon, Khatis' Hyperborea. The whole place is on high alert, with a field of dampening magic covering the entire facility, weakening everything and everyone apart from its scholars and observers to a fraction of their usual capabilities. This pretty much puts our allies on the same level as us for the sake of them being duty support NPCs and not being able to simply stop Hermes by overwhelming him with their strength. The dungeon itself is pretty good. It starts out with us going through the lower floor's different biomes, taking on all sorts of different experimental creatures, which gives the game an excuse to throw a wide range of enemies at us, keeping the whole dungeon feeling fresh all the way through. We make our way up the various floors, taking on yet more experiments, before reaching the top to confront Hermes himself. The encounters are all pretty interesting, and nothing really outstays its welcome. Great dungeon overall, I think, and taking Hermes on ends up being quite a fun encounter in its own right. After the battle, Hermes laments about his failure, and asks Meteion one simple question: was there happiness in those distant stars? Her sisters had communed with the spirits of the deceased and scoured historical records, finding one common thread among all of them. They tried their best to fulfill their potentials and create a world worth living for, and it wasn't enough. They all ended up realising that they'd never be free of fear and sorrow, of anger and despair, as long as they still lived. Their souls cry out for oblivion, and the meteor chose to help everyone on their way, nesting at the edge of the universe to sing their song of despair until it reaches all worlds, including Aetheris, to free everyone from their torment and grant them the peace of death. Meteion is the cause of that huge wave of negative emotion responsible for the final days. After hearing this, Hermes traps us and decides to judge man's right to exist, claiming that if everyone can learn to value all life and retain their will to live, that surely they'd find a way to stop the calamity that Meteion is bringing upon them. He activates Kairos, the memory reconfiguration system brought up earlier, and sets it to wipe all memories of our time here, ensuring what is in his mind a level playing field. We manage to break free from the chains and Venar gives chase to Meteion, but can't keep up. She places some kind of tracking magic on her and manages to escape with us via a confluence leading outside, but Emet-Selch, Hythlodaeus and Hermes succumb to Kairos' effects, forgetting all about what happened since we appeared in Elpis.
Do not squander it. the legacy I leave you.
Final process complete. Executing universal memory alteration.
Vinar takes us back to where we arrived, and lets us know that she'll be carefully gathering allies for the troubles ahead. She sends us home, promising that we will silence the Song of Oblivion, the same promise that Hydaelyn told us about on our way to Sharlayan. So as we're on our way back to the future, we witness Vinar's walk through Amarot shortly after Zodiark's summoning during the final days. She runs into a group crying out for Zodiark to bring things back to the way they were, and as she realises they'll never accept a world where suffering exists, she sunders the planet and everyone on it. I don't think words could ever do justice to this scene. It's a powerful moment where Vinar basically reaches the conclusion that Hermes couldn't. Where he took a more destructive, let man decide his own fate in the face of a world-ending calamity approach, Vinar goes on the route of letting man find his own path forward and learning to live with and rise from the sorrow and despair that he carries with him. In spite of the rest of her people's unwillingness to accept a life without suffering, she sunders them and the world. Unfortunately, this part does suffer from a pretty big plot hole that Vinar, and therefore Hydaelyn, knew about the cause of the final days and could simply have told us in the first place, which kind of drags it down a little bit in my eyes, but I can't deny how well done this whole thing is. It's beautifully presented, and shows Vinar's love for all life and her desire to see it flourish in the face of adversity. It's one of Endwalker's highest points, but it definitely leaves us with a lot of questions for Hydaelyn when we eventually get to talk to her again. After we make it to our own time and travel back to the source, we learn from Krile that the Forum decided to use the Tower of Babel's teleporter to take people to the moon, as opposed to some sort of ship they'd been working on in Labyrinthos. But while escorting civilians to the tower, the final days struck Garlemald. This leads straight into our next big solo battle, where we once again take control of a couple of our allies, fighting blasphemies back while protecting civilians. First we take control of Alphino and get to play around with some of his new Sage abilities alongside Estinian. It's an alright first phase, but I don't play Sage very often, so I'm not used to the very samey looking icons its abilities have. I know that's a me problem, but it did get a little confusing. Next up we play as Alysae alongside Grah'Hatir again, and I actually started to notice they're giving us more abilities in these encounters. Obviously nowhere near the complexity of the full job, but it's a little bit more than just the basics now. There's even a limit break in this phase, which are always nice to see. The Warrior of Light finally arrives on the scene after this, and I've got to point out another minor gripe here. So the signature job, or the job from the trailer, for Endwalker is a Paladin, and as I've been using the trailer jobs for these videos for the most part, Grah'Hatir taking the Paladin role in these cutscenes completely undermines the Warrior of Light. He even replaces us in this callback to the trailer, and it's not the last time you see him as a Paladin protecting us, another Paladin. It's not a major issue as I said, but it just makes us as this character everyone else relies on feel a bit useless. I know I'm going to catch some hate for it, but it really bugged me playing through this again. At any rate, our final phase has us fighting alongside Alysae and G'raha to take on another blasphemy. Once that's down, Alphino and Estinian join us in our final fight against yet another blasphemy, which I've got to admit is pretty cool. I love these moments where you actually get to fight with the Scions backing you up, because it really starts to feel like a throwback to the older party-based RPGs the series is known for. The instance overall is pretty good, but I don't think anything's going to top that one from post-Shadowbringers against all the Primals. It's hard to beat something as intense as that, I think. So we fend off the blasphemies, suffering heavy losses in the process, and as another comes to attack us, Xenos appears out of nowhere to take it down. Eulus rants at him about how he only cares about our next encounter, and Xenos pretty much confirms that's all he's about. As I said earlier, I find it hard to care about him. It's clear we're heading towards some epic final battle with him, but what's the point? Thankfully my girl Alysae backs my point up by telling him he's never going to get what he wants if that's all he cares about. So maybe that's the whole point and we're actually supposed to not care, I don't know. With the blasphemies driven back, we report back to Lucia at our camp in Garlemald, while Alphino asks his father to let us in on the Forum's plans. The Loperates arrive alongside Urianger so that they can learn more about Etheirys and its people, and we make our way back to Sharlayan to learn about what the Forum has really been up to all this time. Our party decides that with no way of tracking Meteion to the edge of the universe ourselves, our best course of action is to consult Hydaelyn herself to figure out how to put an end to the final days once and for all. This leads to the Scions making a deal with the Forum. The spaceship they'd been working on needs some modifications done to its engines, but they don't have the materials they need to finish them. So if we can help maximise the engine's efficiency, we'll be allowed to commune with Hydaelyn. You see, when the Sharlayans discovered a path to Hydaelyn while researching the Ethereal Sea, they constructed a sort of lift to travel down to her in Labyrinthos, so they could receive further instructions from her about the moon and preparing for the final days. And after we meet with their engineer and figure out what we can do to help, we're allowed to use it. To make improvements to the ship's engines, we need refined adamantite from the shards of Dalamud that fell during the Calamity, but thankfully we don't have to go back and delve through the ruins ourselves. All of the allies we've made on our journey are more than happy to help us out, so all we have to do is wait around until they've got us our supplies. This is honestly kind of a dull stretch of late game fetch questing, but it does have a couple of interesting moments. We help the Loporrits learn about Labyrinthos while they offer assistance to some of the Sharlayan citizens. This leads us to gathering a crowd of people alongside Urianger so our furry friends can figure out how best to lend a hand. The meeting is interrupted by the very people Urianger hadn't had the courage to visit during his time at Sharlayan, Moonbreeder's parents. It's an emotional reunion involving an awkwardly long hug from her mother as they all finally get a moment of closure. It honestly makes Moonbreeder's death hit that much harder, because it's plain to see how deeply Urianger cared for her, as well as a reminder of how likeable a character she was in that brief time we spent with her way back in post-ARR. Once we've helped lend a hand where we can, it's back to Sharlayan where everyone, and I mean everyone, has arrived with an enormous amount of adamantite and other supplies for the ship. Hancock, Soroban, Erenville, Sid and the Ironworks crew, Hoary Boulder, Varshan and Nidana, and even really minor characters like the Sky Pirates from Heavensward's Alliance raids have made the journey to bring us everything we need and then some. We even find out that Emiliance Leveilleur herself had been secretly helping to fund the Scion's operations from before we joined them. There's so much going on in this scene, and it's great to see that just about everyone we've met along the way has come back to support us. Upon seeing just how many people have come together to help us, Fortuno finally admits he was wrong to push the twins away and apologises to us all. But people are starting to look a little confused as to what to do, so we rally the troops and start to set our plans into motion. We're finally let into the lower levels of Labyrinthos and enter Thalmazane, where the giant spaceship and, more importantly, our passage to Hydaelyn awaits. This leads to our next dungeon, and a dangerous path through the Ethereal Sea as we enter the Aetioscope. I sure hope I'm pronouncing that one right. This is a really interesting place where the souls of the dead gather and manifest as either dangerous monsters representing unfulfilled lives, or as helpful memories of our departed allies who help us on our way. That rat bastard Ilbird's down here, and Papalimo finally gets not only a mention from someone other than Lys, but a measure of revenge as his memory helps us overcome our old enemy. The first two bosses are these warped versions of Livia and Rititin, remember him, and we get to see other allies helping us, from Moonbreeder to Haurchefant and even Minfilia. This whole dungeon is a great reminder of the friends and enemies we made along the way. The final boss is Amon, whose moveset is reminiscent of the version of him we fought during the Crystal Tower. Partway through the fight, we're helped out by Shiva, who protects us by using her signature diamond dust. After the battle, Amon speaks of a recurring dream he had of the memories Hermes erased back in Elpis, and finally reaches an answer to Hermes' question, that to live is to suffer and that he would end it all himself, but at the end he still has his doubts about his nihilistic outlook. We're interrupted by the soul of Asahi, who finally gets a measure of revenge for Amon as Fandaniel, taking his body and making him an accomplice to the betrayal of his idol, Xenos. I think you guys already know my feelings towards Asahi at this point, but at least it's good to see Amon getting his comeuppance in the end. So we make it to the centre of Aetheris and arrive at the Mothercrystal, coming face to face with Hydaelyn herself. Do we get any real answers about her not telling us about Meteion before? Of course not. She's pretty much been testing us this whole time to make sure we're capable of travelling to the edge of the universe to stop Meteion's Song of Oblivion. We've all known despair, and even though the end is upon us, we still carry on. That's what gives us the strength to silence Meteion and save our world. And knowing this, she still has us prove our worth, as if we hadn't already done that enough, in a battle with her. Honestly, it's really disappointing to have such a cop-out answer to the gaping plot hole of her knowing about Meteion and never telling us. All this time, Hydaelyn basically just had us grow stronger to make sure we could succeed. I mean, I get it, but it's clear the writers didn't plan for us to go back in time until much later in development. In the grand scheme of things, it doesn't make a huge difference, but I think it could have been handled better. At any rate, it's time for our big battle with Hydaelyn. This is actually the first 8-man trial with duty support functionality, where all 7 of the Scions with us can join the fight. It's a great encounter with a ton of varied attacks going off, an ad phase that has us destroying the 6 crystals of light before they power Hydaelyn up, and even a thematically horrifying attack where she conjures up some floods of light. It is a little easy, probably because of using duty support, but as I said earlier, it's a lot of fun to fight alongside all of the scions like a true party-based RPG. And I suppose it makes sense that it's easy given how weakened Hydaelyn has become because of all the rejoinings. So we defeat Hydaelyn and prove our worth, of course, and we learn that the reason for the Sundering was so that mankind could develop a means to overcome despair in a trial leading to untold bloodshed and suffering. With our lesser ether, we needed to find the means to push back the unrelenting wave of dynamis coming from Meteion in order to save the universe. Hydaelyn entrusts us with a crystal containing the memory of Meteion's passage through the stars, and asks us to give it to the Loporrits so that they can guide us to her. Such a journey requires an enormous amount of ether, which Hydaelyn had been hoarding over thousands of years in the form of the Mothercrystal. She offers us one last gift before she disappears. Hydaelyn infuses Azum's crystal with the power of the forces she presided over, stasis, tranquility and peace, granting us mastery over matter itself, and allowing us to give form to the formless, albeit with limited use. She wants us to teach Meteion a new song, one of hope, and to show her that our journey is far from over. Hydaelyn then fades away, leaving mankind to shape its own future without her.
Long after I have gone, though not even my soul remaineth, my love will be with you forever, my dearest children.
Back on the surface, Fortuno and the Forum honour our agreement and allow us to use their ship to travel to the edge of the universe and finally confront Meteion. All that's left is to give the Loporrits a day to modify its engines with their technology from the moon and map out our route to the edge of creation. Retiring to our room, we dream of a familiar voice talking to someone as they drift across the ethereal sea.
Believe me, I'd meant to get some proper sleep. But here we are, drifting along instead.
We spend the next day with the Scions, discussing our plans for the future once this is all over. Thancred and Urianger plan to wander the world helping those in need, while Y'shtola wants to fulfill her promise to Runar and find a way to travel between worlds, as well as visit the other remaining reflections. Alphino and Istinian share a rather soppy moment thanking each other for their support over their long journey, while G'raha and Alisaie fell asleep.
Not a word to anyone. Understood? Not one word.
Man, I have never been so scared of Alisaie. So the day has come for our final journey. We meet with Kryl for our final briefing, where she leaves us with 3 simple words: you must triumph. Heading back down to Thalmazane, we're reintroduced to the ship, now named the Ragnarok. The way we're transporting the ether from the Mothercrystal is actually pretty interesting. Instead of physically moving it, which would be a logistical nightmare, we enlist the support of the beast tribes in summoning their primals to power the engines. There's a bit of a throwaway line about the Ascians incorporating the desire to assimilate others into the beliefs of the summoners, leading the primals to use their powers to enthrall people, but apparently these versions won't have that desire because the summoners' intentions are purer? It's a bit of a weak last-minute explanation as to how they won't go tempering people, to be honest. At any rate, we're handed a set of linked teleportation devices to recall us to the Ragnarok in case of emergency, and it's finally time for the Ragnarok to take off.
Engage! Engage!
As we leave, we see all of the various primals we've encountered fly into its engines. There's an endearing bit of banter between Gerudo and Susano along the way, and thanks to the power of the primals, our party shortly arrives at the edge of the universe, Ultima Thule. One of Meteion's sisters appears on the Ragnarok as we arrive, where she gives a nihilistic speech about how life shouldn't exist before trying to suffocate us with despair.
You approach the bounds of my ultimatum, where emotions dictate reality, where resignation and acceptance unite to embrace the end, where those who yet valiantly cling to life can thrive.
We wake up to find Thancred missing, and head out in search of him. Ultima Thule is a collection of the remnants of fallen worlds, surrounding a dead sun, and despite the suffocating presence of dynamis and very little ether, it's capable of sustaining life. Exploring our surroundings, we come across the ruins of the world that once belonged to the dragons. As Meteion explains to us, this is the memory of a world that once was, this one being the home of Midgard-Solmer before he fled an invading force from Omega's homeworld and came to Aetheris. The dragons here are just shades, existing only to strengthen the dynamis with their endless feelings of despair. Urianger asks what happened to Thancred, and Meteion tells us he's right here beside us, and would tell us himself if he had the form to do so. She explains how she tried to drown out our ether with dynamis, and that in a blink of an eye, Thancred was gone, but he somehow managed to leave a sliver of himself behind, crying out a single word: survive. His wish overpowered the despair that ruled this place, causing the area with the dragons to be remade, and allowing the region to sustain life. Pressing on, we learn of the outcome of the invasion. The dragons were decimated, but the invaders left the planet, claiming it unfit for requisition, and what few dragons remained tried to live on, but could no longer hatch new children due to the damage that had been done to the world. Our party slowly figures out that the despair the dragons feel needs to be overpowered by other emotions so that we can make a path forward, and Estinian manages just that by trying to convince the leader of these dragons to confront his fears and break the cycle of torment and tragedy, sacrificing himself to let us move on. The rest of Ultima Thule plays out in a largely similar fashion. Estinian's sacrifice opens up the path to the remnants of another world, that of the Ea, an intellectually advanced race who shed their mortal flesh to attain a higher existence, and communicate via ether itself, or I suppose in this case dynamis. These ones wish to reclaim their flesh so they can die a proper death, as their search for knowledge led them to discover that the universe will eventually succumb to cold, leaving all life in a permanent ice age. Urianger manages to figure out how these life forms exist in the state they do, believing themselves to still be alive. Meteion must have visited them while they were still alive, and being overwhelmed by their longing for death, she used dynamis to help them achieve it. He and Y'shtola are the next to sacrifice themselves, as they overpower the Ea's negative emotions and clear the way for us, but before they go, Y'shtola reminds us of the magic Hydaelyn imbued Azam's crystal with. We can use it to bring everyone back, but doing so would destroy the paths our friends are creating for us, and stop us from reaching Meteion, so she urges us not to do it. The third world we visit is that of the Omicrons, the race Omega belonged to. These are another race who shed their flesh, but instead ended up converting their minds into data and living as these mechanical creatures, constantly searching for ways to improve their capabilities and conquer the galaxy. According to their leader, Stigma 1, known also as Sir, everyone is working at maximum efficiency and simply awaiting their next orders. They have no purpose and aren't willing to find a new one, but G'raha offers them hope, telling them the tale of the people of the First, who never gave up on their future, despite their world being on the brink of destruction. G'raha's sacrifice opens up the path to our fourth and final world, Necropolis, a rather normal-looking place completely devoid of life. Meteion appears again to explain this is how she found it, not knowing how it all ended. There are signs of recent life around here, but it seems everyone just vanished into thin air. Alphinaud figures it out. There was someone here who wished for it all to end, and he believes that along with Alisaie, he can overcome their will. It's Meteion herself. She's so afraid of experiencing so much despair and ending so many lives that she's completely given up on everything. The twins tell her no matter how many times they've fallen down, they've picked themselves up and carried on, and they're basically saying what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Their sacrifice leaves us all alone, but opens the path forward to the dead star Meteion calls home. Meanwhile, back on Aetheris, an associate of the Scions has arrived at Sharlayan, seeking an audience with Krile and the others.
He wishes to speak with you at once.
I couldn't help but roll my eyes hearing those footsteps. Back at Ultima Thule, standing alone, we sense the presence of someone else, and with the sorrow of 1,000 worlds weighing heavy on us, we forge ahead. This is the single most beautiful moment of the expansion, and I don't think there was a dry eye across the entire player base as we all took that final walk to the end. Hearing the voices of all the friends and allies we made along the way, offering words of encouragement as we prepare for the final battle to decide the fate of the universe. There are very few moments in gaming that I would consider absolutely perfect, and this one might very well be at the top of that list. I've had a fair amount of complaints throughout this expansion, but this washes all of that away and shows how truly magical gaming can be. No other medium can create so many wonderful and memorable moments and put you at the centre of it all. If someone asks me why I love video games, I could just point at this scene, as it is the perfect culmination of such a grand journey. It's had incredible highs and crushing lows. It's made us laugh and made us cry, and even though there's been a fair few stumbles on the way, I love it all the same. This is one of those moments I will never forget, and it hits just as hard the second time through. We confront Meteion just below her nest, and in the face of true despair, we clutch Azum's crystal, bringing forth the souls of two very familiar faces.
I bid them remember, but all this time I'm the one who had forgotten. A right fool you've made of me, Hermes.
As you've called us to the stage, so shall we perform. And creation magics never fail to please.
The creation magics of Hydaelyn and Emet-Selch bring forth a field of Elpis flowers, serving as proof of our hope, a power that Meteion can no longer deny, and sustaining the paths our friends sacrifice themselves for. Invoking Hydaelyn's magic, we bring everyone back to our side and temporarily allow Meteion's original personality to break through, as she begs us to silence her and her sister's Song of Oblivion, opening up the way to our final dungeon, the Dead Ends. Emet-Selch and Hydaelyn bid us a final farewell, with Emet-Selch asking us to fulfill Azum's legacy by visiting all manner of places on Etheirys we've yet to explore, such as the ruins beneath the waters of the Bounty, the golden cities of the New World, and the southern continent of Mericidia. Hydaelyn prays we meet again in this life or the next, and the two fade away. The Dead Ends is just as fascinating as the rest of Ultima Thule in its exploration of long-dead worlds, as we visit a world that fell to pestilence and fend off all manner of warped creatures, before taking off to a world that eradicated disease but fell into an endless cycle of war. At the end of this section, after taking on a giant robotic peacekeeper, we see the world's one remaining citizen successfully killing off everyone else on the planet. The third world is a place where strife no longer existed, and nobody remembered life's trials or its joys. Its people fell into apathy, and created a kind and gentle beast to offer them the sweet release of death. As a dungeon, the Dead Ends is great. There's some nice variety in its environments and enemies, and the boss design is pretty solid. What makes it stand out is Meteion's narration of each of the world's stories of their grim downfalls. It's a great continuation of Ultima Thule's theme of despair and suffering, as depressing as that sounds. Overcoming her trials, Meteion still doesn't understand our determination to carry on. The combined power of all her sisters forms the Endsinger, a terrifying winged creature that forms and throws whole planets at us to try and stop us. The blue Meteion we met in Elpis flies in to beg her sisters to stop, but it's no use. As the Endsinger is about to finish our friends off, we hit the button on our teleporter and throw it away, sending everyone back to the Ragnarok while we confront the Endsinger ourselves. But as she prepares to attack, we hear something breaking into the Dead Star.
My ultimatum. What is happening?
At the end of everything, I find you, my friend.
Of course it's Xenos. He struck a deal with our allies on Etheirys to use what was left of the Mothercrystal to reclaim Shinryu's form and fly to the edge of creation for our final battle. And as much as I still don't care about any of that, I can't deny how awesome it is to ride a dragon into our final battle at the end of the universe.
I take it this is your prey. But why does it still live? Surely it is no match for you. So come! Let us dispense with this distraction, you and I!
This really is the most Final Fantasy thing to ever happen, isn't it? It's not a particularly difficult trial, but it's still an amazing final boss fight. A nice range of attacks again, including having to watch where two planets collide to avoid taking damage, as well as some knockbacks and so on. The music, however, is the real highlight. It's this incredible arrangement of all of the previous final boss themes from ARR in each expansion. The main Final Fantasy theme is mixed in there too, and it is simply epic. There's a quick ad phase in the middle. Well, it's just one enemy, but it's still an ad either way, which ends with us having to use another level 3 tank limit break to survive a planet being dropped on our heads. We make it through that, but the Endsinger prepares to drop a second planet on us, this time with us having no way to defend ourselves against it. The Scion's prayers save us all from oblivion, and empower us to put a stop to the Endsinger and silence her song once and for all, in what is a bit of a role reversal where we're pretty much listening to our own boss music as she struggles to put up a fight. It's a great way to end things, even if it is the typical killing God with the power of friendship trope that's been a constant throughout the game. With the Endsinger defeated, Meteion wishes to hear and experience our thoughts, and realises that there's no single answer to Hermes' question of what gives our lives meaning. The answer he sent her and her sisters off to find was on Aetherius all along, and before she fades away for good, she sings one last song, a song of hope, bringing new life to those worlds lost to despair. She creates a path back to our ship so that we can return home, but there's one little thing we've still got to take care of. Xenos. I still really don't care about him, but when he turns round and asks if we seek out stronger foes to push us to our limits for the sake of the thrill of it all, well, that I can't deny. This is just one last fight to blow off some steam at the end, and it's alright, I guess. It kind of undermines the Endsinger as the final boss, but given that she was a last minute addition, it's not that big of a deal, honestly. Having to put up with Xenos yelling, "A test of your reflexes!" over and over is pretty silly though. So we finally finish Xenos off for good this time, at least I hope it's for good, and being pushed beyond our limits, we collapse and listen to Xenos ramble on about finding fulfillment, and I still don't care about him. The teleporter pad appears next to us and activates, taking us back to the Ragnarok, where we wake up surrounded by our friends who all have a go at us for making them worry, and we arrive back home as the credits roll. The universe is saved, the Ascians and Primals are no longer a threat, Hydaelyn and Zodiark are gone, and we've all earned a much needed rest. Alphinaud writes a letter to his parents, claiming that we're disbanding the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, at least officially speaking. Unofficially we'll be going back to working in secret, as the Scions once did before we joined up with them, for the protection of the realm. Our group all goes about their separate business, with the twins going to Garlemald, Y'shtola heading back to Dravania to seek more knowledge from the library and visit her old mentor, Thancred and Urianger heading to Sharlayan with the intention of seeking out the Loporrits, Garhar and Kral heading back to the Baldessian Annex to help rebuild their order, and Estinian returning to Rods at Harn to take care of something for Vritra. What's next for our Warrior of Light? Well, onwards to the next adventure, wherever it takes us. So that's Endwalker, and the decade-long saga of Hydaelyn and Zodiark is over, and what an incredible journey it's been. Endwalker is by no means perfect, but the way it wraps up virtually every major plot thread and delivers a genuinely satisfying conclusion is fantastic. I would have liked to have seen Garlemald before it went to ruin, and I'm still not sure if I'm a fan of the direction they went with the Empire basically crumbling from within. Xenos felt pretty pointless, and that final battle with him was basically just to blow off some steam after saving the universe rather than some grand conclusion to what could have been an epic rivalry. I've never liked the Final Fantasy trope of having a big villain reveal after taking down the one you've been preparing yourselves for throughout your entire journey. It felt out of nowhere for the likes of Cloud of Darkness in 3, Zeromus in 4, Ultimecia in 8, and it's not much better in 14. Meteion does get plenty of build-up, and stopping the Final Days became our main objective back in Shadowbringers, but all this time we've been trying to take down the Ascians and deal with Zodiark, only to find out that's not it. It's a great twist that the big bad was actually keeping us safe all along, but it's a little bit disappointing to see 14 fall back on something that's never really worked for me personally. That said, Endwalker does a lot right. Everything's dealt with, there's no major threat waiting in the wings, and despite its many issues, the ending was incredibly emotional and satisfying. It's as close as I think we were ever going to get to a perfect ending, but even then you've got to be able to forgive some pretty big missteps. At the end of the day, I do look forward to leaving everything behind and moving on to new adventures. I don't think they could possibly up the stakes after saving the entire universe, but I'm really excited to see where the story goes from here. Between Endwalker and Dawntrail, however, is what many consider a filler arc, but part of me thinks there's going to end up being more to it than that. Endwalker's patch content ended up fairly divisive. The glaring lack of a proper relic grind and instead being forced to play through the Hildebrand questline, one of those love it or hate it stories, as well as not having a field exploration zone like Eureka or Bosja, was a huge disappointment for many. On the other hand, we got some new and fresh types of content. The Island Sanctuary is a sort of light farming sim, as well as variant dungeons which added split paths that led to various different stories and outcomes, both of which had problems of their own, but personally I respect the attempt and hope that the right lessons were learned from the feedback they got from it all. The main scenario had its own problems. With base Endwalker being a decisive conclusion and Dawntrail still being a ways off, something needed to fill the gap. Enter the Newfound Adventure Arc, a short storyline that kicks off with us going treasure hunting with a few of our friends and leads to unexpected places. A lot of people consider this a filler arc, and I'm almost inclined to agree, but it does leave things open enough that the characters we meet could return in the not too distant future. So let's dive in. We arrive at the Rising Stones, which has now been repurposed into a shop for our master artisan Tataru to peddle her wares, and we're advised to check out Radzat Han to learn more about the ruins beneath the Bounty, the sea which separates Thavnair from Ilsabard's mainland. While we wait for Tataru to finish sewing our new outfit together, we fall asleep and see what appears to be Xenos' Reaper avatar arriving back in the empty void that is the 13th. After a quick conversation with a historian named Jalheen, we learn that the ruins are actually home to a sunken treasure vault belonging to Alzadal, the leader of a tribe of Al-Ra and a key figure in the history of Radzat Han. The treasure vault in question is connected to a small island at the centre of the Bounty, and a merchant in the city just so happens to be selling a map to it, complete with a magical seal which opens the way to the vault. So we hit the markets and bump into Estinian, who buys the map for far too much money after seeing the merchant selling it has an orphan working with him, acting as a desperate potential buyer to drive interest in his wares. Estinian's hope is that some of the money makes its way to the orphan so that he and his apparently sick sister might use it to live a better life. We manage to borrow a boat so that we can reach the island, but need a few friends for the perilous journey, so it's off to Sharlayan to pick up Grahatia and Ishtola, the latter of whom we wake up after she'd fallen asleep studying in a library, before heading down to Thalmazane to pick up Urianger, who had been helping the Loporrits find a new purpose for the moon now that it's no longer needed as a spacefaring vessel alongside Thancred. Our favourite infiltration expert chooses not to join us, as too many scions in one place could draw suspicion, so he instead opts to scout out the situation in the Far East. One thing that's quite interesting about this part of the main scenario is we finally get access to an in-game glossary of sorts called the Unending Codex. It's got a bunch of records of past events and full character bios, and is a more than welcome addition to the game. Honestly, I wish this thing was added to the start of ARR when they implemented it, but what we do have serves as a helpful reminder of who everyone is and what we've been up to. It's great for returning players to catch up on things with. So we head back to Thavnair and set sail for its lost treasure vault, which leads to our first post-Endwalker dungeon, Alzadal's Legacy. It's a nice jaunt across this hidden island with some fairly unique boss encounters to boot. After the first boss, which is basically a giant squid, we come across a teleporter to take us to the depths of the Bounty and straight towards the treasure vault. There's some big aquarium vibes going on down here before we run through corridors full of gold and other treasures. It reminds me of the drowned city of Scala from post-Stormblood, only a lot better maintained. And that end boss with its weird spinning mechanic is surprisingly fun. I love seeing these more creative designs, and even though it's a bit gimmicky, it really helps to keep things fresh. At the end of this dungeon is a device that looks similar to the alchemical furnaces used in Radzat Han. Before we can check it out, Varshan interrupts us, and explains that it was created to seal a functioning void gate away from the world. Some 5,000 years ago, the Allagan Empire invaded the dragon's homeland of Mericidia, defeating Bahamut and resulting in the desperate Mericidians summoning primals to turn the tide. In response, Emperor Xande forged a covenant with the Cloud of Darkness, opening a void gate atop the Crystal Tower for their hordes to come flooding through. No matter how many of the Void Sent the dragons struck down, more kept on coming. Vritra and his sister Ashdaya were among the dragons fighting this battle, and in one last-ditch effort to put a stop to the Void Sent, Ashdaya flew straight into the Void Gate itself to strike at the root of their strength. As Vritra tried to follow, the Void Gate closed right in front of him, and his sister has been lost ever since. Thousands of years later, when the city of Radzat Han was founded, Vritra enlisted the help of the alchemists to find a way to cross the void via this gate under the sea. He used a simulacrum much like Varshan to cross over, but was unable to find his sister. Instead, he found countless Void Sent, clamouring to breach the gate and enter our world, so his only choice was to retreat and seal it away. Naturally, our party decides to find a way to safely enter the Void Gate and search for Ashdaya. The pacing of this first patch is horribly slow, to be honest. There's a lot of going back and forth with very little to do other than watch cutscenes. It's an interesting story, don't get me wrong, but a lot of it is really stretched out when it needn't have been. When it eventually picks up, it's great, but the setup is painfully slow at times. Meanwhile, elsewhere, no really, it actually says meanwhile elsewhere this time, we see a meeting between an intimidating knight in black and 4 entities connected to thrones that surround him. They discuss the Void Gate and how their goal is to seize redemption for their world, and any fan of Final Fantasy IV will immediately recognise this group as Golbez and the Four Fiends. I really wasn't kidding when I said Endwalker was the FF4 expansion. Back in Radzat Han, our party sets about finding a way to open the Void Gate wide enough for us to enter, as well as a way to safely traverse it. A trip to Sharlayan is in order, and after visiting Monteshane and Fortuneau, we're given the forum's permission to look through the forbidden section of their great library, where we discover records on the creation of an artificial void scent known as an Atomos, which you may remember from the World of Darkness. These creatures absorbed a planar fissure into their own flesh, which they could expand at will into a functioning void gate, which is precisely what we need to travel to the 13th ourselves. To Thavnair we go once more, and visit Nadana at the Great Work, who's happy to help us in creating this artificial Atomos. All that remains is how to avoid the corrupting influence of the Void. Y'shtola summons a pair of familiars called Nixies to test how well a warding scale would work, in the most adorable fashion you could imagine.
Water, froth and fire!
Ready your arms. I fear she's been possessed.
The test proves successful, with the one using the warding scale unharmed, and the other corrupted by the Void. The scale itself, however, is showing signs of degradation, so it needs some sort of modification before we can use it to safely travel throughout the 13th. So we head to Rhalga's Reach to meet with Cid and the Ironworks crew to see if there's anything they can do to help with that. Cid suggests a rather simple solution: give it some armour. He wants to use an alloy with high ethereal conductivity to create a protective casing so that the warding scales can't take damage and therefore won't be susceptible to the Void's corruption. After a short while, our Atomos and the reinforced warding scales are ready to go, and our party prepares to travel to the 13th. Varshan's coming with us as well, but not in his current state. The alchemists at the Great Work have constructed a new vessel for Vrita to travel in, an adult version of Varshan, capable of defending himself if the need arises. While everyone was making preparations, Y'shtola paid a visit to Urianger and was given the crystal Hydaelyn gave us to track Meteion down with. She hands it to us, claiming that the power of light it contains might prove useful on our trip to the 13th. And so, with the Radiant host, led by Big Brother Nabdeen, defending the vault, we have our artificial Atomos absorb the Void Gate and we enter the Void, leading to our next dungeon, the Fell Court of Troya. First impressions of this dungeon are pretty good. I love the warped look of the prison we start in, and there's a great rendition of the Troya theme from FF4 to go with it. The first boss, however, isn't great. It's just a big group of normal enemies, which is pretty forgettable to be honest. Thankfully the other two bosses make up for it and are actually pretty fun, with the final boss, the Earth Fiend Scarmiglione, entering to a fantastic rendition of the FF4 boss theme. Definitely one of those dungeons I make sure to turn the music up for, and the battle itself is great. Once we beat Scarmiglione, we set about looking for information, which has us run into a familiar void scent, Xenos' Reaper avatar. Hydaelyn's crystal has some sort of reaction to it, and returns its original form of a woman. It turns out she was forced to serve Xenos, rather than any pact being formed, which twisted her essence into the form we saw before. She teaches us of the Contra Memoria, the great war which shattered the balance between light and dark, causing darkness to engulf this world. All life was transformed into the monsters we call Voidsent, but this woman is only part Voidsent due to her still being in the womb when the darkness reached her mother. Unfortunately, our new Voidsent friend doesn't recall her name, and with us needing something to call her by, Y'shtola suggests Zero, to mean a beginning, because it remains to be seen what she'll become to us. In return for all the information Zero shared with us, she asks for some of our ether. You see, the 13th inhabitants don't do something for nothing, and instead strike bargains with one another. In this case, information for ether, the one thing valued above all else here. While arranging for Y'shtola to give Zero some of hers, Scarmiglione returns to attack us. Death doesn't exist on the 13th, and anyone who is killed can freely resurrect themselves, provided another Voidsent isn't around to consume their ether. When someone's ether is absorbed, their soul becomes part of the one who consumed them, together with their memories and thoughts, and if they're then killed, the souls they absorb have the potential to break free and become separate entities again. It's an endless cycle of rebirth, with nobody being granted the freedom to simply no longer exist. Scarmiglione summons a group of Void Scent to attack us, and no matter how many times we take them down, they keep coming back. Zero knows of a way to stop this, but refuses to help without getting something in return. Y'shtola then reminds her that she gave Zero her name, and despite her not asking for it, she did accept it, and decides to help us out. She takes down every Void Scent in front of us with ease, trapping them in crystals, and it's time for round 2 with Scarmiglione. It's largely reminiscent of our first encounter with him, but with a few extra Void Scent summoned which Zero quickly takes down. After the battle, Zero traps Scarmiglione in another of these crystals, and we see a flashback of Golbez meeting with the Void Scent who would become his 4 Archfiends. This confirms Hydaelyn's presence. Golbez has her trapped with some kind of spell, and the Archfiends had consumed some of her more powerful ether to become as strong as they are, so that they can command Golbez's armies. So these crystals Zero trapped the Void Scent's essences in are called Memoria, and as far as she knows, this transformation of the Void Scent's essence is permanent. Many wielded this power during the Contra Memoria, but Zero is the only one left who can still use it. In search of more information on Hydaelyn, our party joins up with Zero as we travel to her domain, a sort of sanctuary for weaker Void Scent who had nowhere else to go. After doing a bit of digging around, we learn that the next of the fiends, Barbaricia, has tracked us down. She comes straight to Zero's domain, where we get confirmation that Golbez still has Hydaelyn. Barbaricia then flees to her domain, Storm's Crown, and we give chase. This next trial is great. In fact, all of the trials in this questline are. There's a lot of movement going on, we get trapped by her hair coming out of the ground and have to slowly and carefully dodge incoming attacks while avoiding getting snapped back to the point we're tethered to, and there's this awesome transition into the second phase where Barbaricia jumps up into the air and comes crashing down on us. This is followed by a ton more movement, really keeping you on your toes the whole time. If you're playing Black Mage for any of these trials, I feel really sorry for you. After taking her down and letting Zero do her thing, we add another Memoria crystal to our collection. Sadly, the echo doesn't kick in this time for a flashback, and after exerting herself to finish Barbaricia off, Zero collapses, drained of ether. Our party decides the best course of action would be to take her back to the source, where its ambient ether should help her recover. When she finally wakes up, Varshan offers Zero some food, and instead of eating it, she absorbs one of the apple's ether. Turns out she hasn't eaten in a very long time, and after actually tasting the apple for herself, we find out that her sense of taste has dulled. We'll get back to that in a little bit. So we take Zero on a quick tour of Radz-at-Han, and request her help in our return trip to the Void. She agrees to come with us, so long as she's kept well fed. Meanwhile, Golbez and the 2 remaining fiends meet to discuss their plans.
The war looms nigh. We cannot allow these interlopers to interfere.
The Archfiend of Fire, and my favourite in both FF4 and 14, Rubicante, hatches a plan to deal with us, which requires the help of the Archfiend of Water, Cagnazzo. There's a brief flashback of Golbez killing a robed figure, claiming that the Blessed Damned shall set them free. Not much else is revealed at this point, but it's interesting learning about this version of Golbez's story. As I said way back near the start of the video, I love how 14 takes these characters from older games and fits them into its world without feeling like they're just there for fan service. And while the nostalgia trip of this storyline is great, there's a lot more to it than that. It's not a simple retread of FF4's story, even though Zero is blatantly the stand-in for Cecil. I don't mind that, by the way, it's just that I could see it coming a mile away. But again, there's more to it than that. Zero in particular has some great character development, with her time on the Source reintroducing her to concepts she'd all but forgotten about, such as friendship and trust, as well as some rather endearing scenes we'll get to in a bit. Back in Radz-at-Han, our party prepares for our return trip to the 13th, when Vritra senses his sister's presence and calls out to her. Apparently she's somewhere north, so we take a detour to Garlemald to find out what's going on. Arriving in Tertium, the subway station where the First Legion was holed up, we're reunited with Alphinaud and Alisaie, who catch us up on what's been going on in the remains of the Garlean capital. They're forming an interim government, but large-scale reconstruction is still a long ways off. The Garleans are slowly learning to trust the twins after initially wanting nothing to do with them, and it's looking like their people are well on the way to recovering from the Empire's downfall. Regarding Hydaelyn, apparently Garlemald has had a recent influx of Void-sent visitors, and the twins have tracked their point of origin to the mountains to the east. Unfortunately, getting there is a bit of an issue, but we're able to make use of a large snowmobile to cut a path through the rough terrain and make it to the location of an old Reaper Order's hideout. It's in need of repairs, however, and there's more Void-sent in the area for us to take care of, so we join Alisaie in tracking a few more of them down. Meanwhile, Zero joins Alphinaud back at Tertium, helping to hand out rations to the Garlean citizens. Eulus arrives and gets himself acquainted with our Void-sent friend, and the two bond over a type of dumpling from the Azim steppe called booze. It's got a spicy filling, and Zero takes a liking to its strong flavour. A woman after my heart right there. Food is actually a surprisingly common theme in this questline, and as a lover of spicy stuff like this, I'm all for it. And we'll get to the curry, alright? We rejoin our friends only to be interrupted by a soldier who tells them that a horde of void scent is coming from the east. Zero stays behind, still stubbornly refusing to help without some form of compensation, but when Euless receives a call about losing contact with a unit transporting supplies, he rushes to help. Zero interrupts him, claiming that he'd be stupid to go alone with all the void scent in the area, and because she can't repay him for the food if he's dead, she heads out to track the unit down. We actually get to play as Zero in this section, as she takes on a large group of void scent out in the snow. It's a lengthy battle which culminates in a fight with the leader of the group, who eventually overwhelms Zero. Gravely wounded, she passes out, and we're shown a flashback of a time during the Contra Memoria where she was attacked by 3 Memorias, people who can use her power of trapping others in Memoria crystals, who would succumb to the temptation of using the powers of darkness. While Zero laments about making the same mistakes again, we arrive alongside the twins to back her up. Round 2 goes much more smoothly, and working together we take down the remaining void scent and restore safety to Garlemald. Back at Tertium, we're rejoined by Estinian and Stola, and are ready to head into the mountains. Zero decides to join us without asking for payment, as our rescue kindled something inside her that she doesn't understand, and she wishes to act on it. As I said before, she's slowly starting to learn about friendship, and gradually changes from someone who is honestly fairly bland and all business, to a kinder, more understanding and mature person, and it ends up making her quite likeable in the end. So it's time for our next dungeon, Lapis Manalis. This is another one of those dungeons that starts with us taking on a handful of enemies on a moving platform, the big snowmobile in this case, before arriving at a mountain range with a great view of Garlemald, including the still ominous Tower of Babel in the distance. It continues Endwalker's tradition of really fun bosses as well. Nothing particularly taxing, but I really enjoy these fights that have a lot of movement, and the final boss, Cagnazzo, has a ton of this. That's right, the Archfiend of Water has made it into the source, and it's another great fight. There's even this neat callback to his shield phase in FF4 where if you'd hit him he'd throw out a powerful counterattack. Here it's just him building up power in the ad phase, but it's a nice touch regardless. So we defeat our third Archfiend, and this time he's simply just able to die normally, due to him being here on the source. Before he dies, he reveals the presence Vritra felt wasn't his sister, but one of her eyes that Cagnazzo had with him. He claims his part in the Fiends' scheme is over, and at long last he can go to join the great flow of ether and die for real. With our job done, we gather some fuel for the Garleans while we're in the area, and we make our way back to Radzat Han. Preparing to depart for the 13th, we see an explosion coming from the direction of Alzadal's legacy. While we were dealing with Cagnazzo, the treasure vault, including our Void Gate, has been destroyed by the 4th fiend Rubicante, who's now headed for a nearby mountain and the site of our next trial, Mount Ordeals. This is my favourite trial from this questline. The fact that Square Enix actually got Kenichi Mayamada, aka Hydaelyn, to do the arrangement of the battle with the 4 fiends in a similar style to his original cover that he put out well over a decade ago is insanely cool. Seriously, go look up his original cover, it's awesome. No wait, do it when you finish watching this! The fight itself is fantastic. Again, it's another trial with a lot of movement, and there's this interesting attack where he follows a line on the ground to a glyph that launches a triangular AoE at the party while they're trapped on the spot. Only after the first time it happens, part of the floor rotates, so you have to track the lines so you can stand in the safe area. Really distracting while you're trying to pelt him with attacks, but honestly I love that mechanic, and the extreme version adds even more complexity to it. We even get to see what's under his cloak in the second phase, which is a thing that happens. Overall it's a great fight with an even better soundtrack, and I love seeing it pop up in the roulettes. Gushing about my favourite of the 4 fiends aside, we take Rubicante down and learn a bit more about Golbez and his plan. He wants to escape the purgatory of undeath that is the 13th, so that he and his people can finally be allowed to die for real. Their home is a lost cause, and they see invading the source as their only choice to reclaim their mortality. Rubicante tells us to seek Golbez on the 13th's red moon before he fades away. So with the 4 fiends out of the picture and the Void Gate destroyed, we need to figure out a way to the 13th moon. Ishtola heads off to Sharlayan to try and learn what she can, and we're back to looking after Zero in Radzat Han. She's taken quite the liking to spicy food, and after helping her pick out some spices, we sit down for a nice hot curry with her.
Sisters have mercy. The smell alone is...
I've been waiting for this. Come, let's replenish our ether.
Honestly, this scene just exists for the hilarity of everyone else not being able to handle the spices, and it reminds me of a lot of times when I've been out with friends and just watched them sweat over vindaloos and the like. Where are the rest of the sides though? Just the curry and naan? Come on, if you're going to make a curry, go all out with it. Man, all this food talk is making me really hungry. So after that rather indulgent scene, we bring some food to Estinian in his room and okay, I'm going to need a cold shower after this. Where was I? Oh, right. So Urianger and Y'shtola arrive with a plan on how to get to the 13th moon. They want to open a larger void gate on our moon to travel straight to our destination. The source's reflections share most of the same geography, you see, so the 13th moon is roughly in the same place as ours, and this would be the easiest way of getting to Golbez. To set up the void gate, however, we need access to the Tower of Babel, as well as an enormous amount of ether. The ether's first on our list, which has us visiting the Sharlayan Forum again for help with finding and transporting it. Naturally, they agree to let us do our thing and give us access to the containers they originally planned to use for the Ragnarok's fuel, as well as its fuel source before we used the Mothercrystal, a font of ether on the nearby Isle of Harm. Before we set sail for the island, we learn that our Gleaner friend Erenville is taking a long trip back to his homeland. We'll come back to that later. Thancred joins the party at the last minute, and it's off to our next dungeon, the Ether Font. I love the atmosphere of this place, and the chill arrangement of the Sharlayan theme really adds to it. We make our way across this lush island, culling the rather unruly wildlife, before delving into the crystal cavern below to reach the font itself. Great colourful environments throughout, and the end boss being FF4's Octomammoth was another nice surprise. I know this whole storyline is based on that game, but I didn't expect to see this thing here at all. I think this dungeon and Lapis Manalis are my favourites of the level 90 dungeons, and the nostalgia trip definitely helps. Step 2 of our plan involves another trip to Garlemald so we can get permission to use the Tower of Babel. The Garlean citizens still associate it with Xenos and Fandaniel, so we need to convince them that our intentions are pure and they have nothing to fear. We meet with their current leaders, who stubbornly refuse us, with one of them being stuck in the past and not wanting anything to do with foreign nations whatsoever. But when the stubborn one storms off and needs saving from one of the rogue war machines in the ruined city, Eulus convinces him to help us. Honestly, this is where Eulus finally starts to turn into a more likeable character. I was really harsh on him back when we first met, and rightfully so, but between this and his moment with Zero, he's really turning into a more understanding and respectful person. He sees his people's struggles and he knows that they need support, regardless of the past. He's got a sort of future leader vibe to him, and I wouldn't be against him rising to power as Garlemald gets back on its feet. With preparations ready, we call upon Vritra to make his way to the moon in his true form, as opposed to Varshan, and we open up the giant void gate in the remains of Zodiark's prison, using its newly restored brands to prevent any void scent from breaking through. Arriving on the 13th red moon, we come across a Memoria crystal containing the memories of Golbez. We see a flashback of him fighting alongside a man named Durante during the Contra Memoria, who happens to have the same voice as the man we're hunting down. The pair run into Zero, who refuses to join their crusade against the darkness. This is painting Golbez as a hero, not the villain we know him to be. The man himself arrives, alongside the imprisoned Hydaelyn.
So, you have come. You, who would oppose our crusade. It is for the dragon that you have come, yes?
He uses the power of darkness to transform her into a shadow dragon, and our fight begins.
Rise, O Shadow Dragon, and obey!
It's another fantastic trial, sticking with the theme of having a lot of movement going on, as we take Golbez on alongside the warped Hydaelyn on this cube platform above the moon. There's an awesome second phase transition where he fuses the dragon with his sword, and the variety of attacks really keeps you busy. As I said earlier, these trials are some of Endwalker's best, and it's a good thing too because we only got one optional trial in the patch cycle. Not that there was a lack of trials, of course, they just put them all in the MSQ. After defeating Golbez, he throws Hydaelyn into the chasm below, joining her with the ether belonging to the 13th shard of Zodiark, and using her longing to return home to drive a new entity's desires in order to break through to the source. That entity, as you might have predicted, is Zeromus. There's none of that mind control stuff going on here, it's just a simple case of Golbez summoning FF4's final boss. It's too strong for Zero to trap in Memoria, and the overwhelming presence of darkness starts to damage our warding scales, so we're forced to retreat home. Luckily for us, Zeromus still needs time to properly form, but time isn't on our side. We need a plan to safely return to the 13th and take it down before it invades the source. Y'shtola meets with Cid and the Ironworks crew, who make us some ether transmitters. As the name would suggest, these devices transfer ether across large distances, but we're going to be using them across entire worlds. The plan is to travel to the first and siphon light from the empty region beyond where the flood of light was stopped, through the Crystal Tower and into the 13th, piercing the shroud of darkness surrounding Zeromus' domain. Zero decides to join us, as she can easily separate her essence from her body for transporting via spirit vessel due to her void-sent nature. So it's once again back to visit our old friends in Norvrent. Arriving in the Crystarium, we track down Reen to have her use her control over light to help us, while Beck Lug takes control of the tower. Much like with the Tower of Babel, we need to visit and reassure the first people that what we're doing is safe, due to them still associating light with the likes of Vorthri and the Sin Eaters. This is more or less an excuse to catch up with our old friends, and I'm totally fine with that. First it's off to Yulmore to meet with my favourite couple from Norvrent, the Chais. Naturally, Chai News is happy to help, and sets about gathering the Yulmoran citizens to explain our plight. With the famed Warrior of Darkness wanting to save their world, the people are sure to understand what needs to be done. Next it's off to the Raktika Greatwood to meet with Runar of the Knights Blessed. Upon hearing his dear master Matoya's homeworld is under threat, he's more than happy to let us do our thing while he explains the situation to his people. Finally it's off to Armoreng, where we run into Magnus and the trolley-obsessed miners who get us to our destination of Nabartha Reng in no time. While everyone's getting the transmitters set up, Zero tries to absorb some of the light from where the flood was halted, but it overwhelms her, causing her to collapse.
If this power were mine to wield...
I will not succumb! Not to darkness! Not to light!
Thankfully, Reen is able to help her control it, and with this new power, Zero pledges to return to the Void and fight for the world that once was, and for those she holds dear. She's finally understanding trust and friendship, and is driven to save her world. Unfortunately, that's the end of our return to the First. As I said in the Shadowbringers video, I really hope we get to come back here with everyone for a proper return, and with Reen focusing on trying to restore the land that was destroyed by the Flood, there's a ton of potential for exploring more of the First, maybe using that whole time fluctuation thing as an excuse to see it several years in the future or something. So it's back to the Void we go, and using the Aether transmitters, we successfully siphon light from the First to open a path into Golbez and Zeromus' domain, and our final dungeon, the Lunar Subterrane. Hearing the Baron theme was a bit confusing at first, seeing as we're going through a cavern on the moon, but after we take on the classic Dark Elf for our first boss, we come across Golbez's Memoria Crystal, which pulls us into his memories of the city of Baron during the Contra Memoria. Fighting through the city's streets alongside Durante, we come across the Antlion, goofy face and all, for our second boss. It's another great encounter with a lot of shifting and sinking sands, where we've got to watch out for some crumbling pillars on either side of the arena. Finally we come to Castle Baron itself, under siege by Voidsent and a handful of Memoriats. As we reach the inner courtyard, we see Golbez being consumed by the darkness coming from a Memoriat Durante had just taken down, turning him hostile and forcing Durante to use the power of a Memoria Crystal to take his dear friend out. This transformed version of Durante serves as our final boss, and it's another great, albeit incredibly easy, encounter. After defeating Durante, he strikes Golbez down, trapping him in the crystal and taking up his name for himself. The version of Golbez we've been fighting all this time is actually Durante, and in his own words, an imposter playing a hero. We learn that Golbez was tricked by the Ascian Igayom, who we ourselves killed back in Heavensward. She had him kill the 13th version of the Watcher, the ancient shade overseeing Zodiark's prison, which caused the flood of darkness which engulfed the 13th. Despite his methods, Golbez is actually quite similar to Ardbert. He wants to see his world saved, and in parallel to our old friend, accidentally caused the flood of darkness. Without a similar event happening on the source, however, the abundance of darkness had nowhere to go, thus creating an empty void instead of the Ascians' plan of a rejoining. This caused Golbez to renounce the idea of ever trusting another person, and despite Zero offering help, he stubbornly refuses, relying on Zeromus to break down the barrier between worlds and restore the Great Flow to the 13th. Summoning shades of the 4 Archfiends, Golbez makes his last stand above the abyss where Zeromus dwells. Our party stays behind to fend him off, while we jump down into the Abyssal Fracture for our final trial against Zeromus. It's yet another outstanding fight, with a ton of movement and a banger of a rendition of the final boss theme from FF4. Regarding the music, I will say the Red Wings theme was a bit of a strange choice for the second phase, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't love hearing it. Speaking of the second phase, Zeromus breaks down the barrier between worlds, and we see the Source's moon through cracks outside the arena. It's a great visual touch and honestly a little distracting, and apparently the Loporrits and everyone else on the moon got to see our battle unfold as well. So we take Zeromus down and it almost immediately resurrects, but our allies jump down to defend us from it. In what is a really unfortunate time for the Echo to kick in, we see our party defeat Golbez, and Zero extend an olive branch to him in the form of light once again entering the void. He joins the fight, shielding us from Zeromus' attacks, but when Zero tries to finish it off, she's blasted back and engulfed by darkness. In the pitch black of the suffocating dark, she hears her new friends calling out to her, harnesses the power of light within, and FF4 fans will have guessed this, she becomes a paladin.
With this power from beyond the rift, I can do it. I can save everyone.
With the combined power of light and dark, Zero and Golbez strike Zeromus down once more. Vritra calls out to Hydaelyn, separating her essence from Zeromus, and Zero finally traps the monster in Memoria.
Hear my voice and return to me!
Kom an, Andrakeen.
No more, fiend!
The threat of the 13th is dealt with, but Hydaelyn is without corporeal form. Vritra uses his eye from Varshan to grant her a new form, Zero convinces Golbez to join her side in fighting to restore their world, and our party heads back home. Before we leave, Y'shtola summons another Nixie, this time with the incantation changed, to act as a beacon for us to find Zero should we ever return to the Void.
Come forth, my servant. I revised the incantation, which is not to say you know how it went before. Are we clear?
And that's the end of the Newfound Adventure storyline. Even if it is something of a filler arc, it was a great nostalgia trip with its own take on Final Fantasy IV's world and villains. I do think there's more to it than it just being filler, and I'm sure we'll see more of Zero and Golbez at some point in the future, even if it's just side quests in a future expansion. For now, all that's left is to set things up for the next expansion, Dawntrail. Back on the source, Alphinaud and Alizé have left Garlemald in the hands of its citizens, having earned a much needed rest. We make a quick trip back to the First to deliver a Mothercrystal to our allies in the hope that they can harness some of its darkness to help restore some of the world, and back in Sharlayan, Erenville arrives from his trip home with a new companion, while we see Kryl opening an old letter addressed to her grandfather, requesting the students of Baldessian's help in exploring the Golden City in Tural. We catch up with Erenville and his companion and longtime friend, Wook-Lamart, who both just so happen to be from Tural. Erenville had been downplaying it to avoid getting bombarded with questions about the relatively unknown new world. Wook-Lamart, on the other hand, is here to request the Warrior of Light's assistance in a contest to decide the new ruler of Tuliolal, the northern nation in Tural.
This is her, the adventurer you crossed the seas to meet.
Ooh, you weren't exaggerating. It's plain she's no ordinary woman. I'm Wook-Lamart, claimant to the throne of Tuliolal.
This boisterous Hrothgar, and the first female of the race we've met due to them finally being added in Dawntrail, is the adopted daughter of the current ruler of Tuliolal, a Mamuljar by the name of Gulul Jar Jar, and one of the claimants to the throne of Tuliolal's Dawn Servant. Apparently the contest is going to involve the fabled City of Gold and the legendary beast Valagar Manda, which gives Kryl an incentive to join us on our new adventure. Before asking us to make our decision about the contest, Wook-Lamart suggests we go on a hunt together to get better acquainted. Thankfully we'll be going on official business, as Erenville lets us know of a petition for help on the Isle of Harm, the site of the Aether Font. Some of the local wildlife are running amok, and it's up to us to cull some of them and find out why they're so aggressive. This leads to a rather lengthy and honestly pretty interesting solo duty which we use as part of the dungeon. Alongside Grah'Hatir and Wook-Lamart, we explore a previously closed off portion of the island while tracking our prey. It turns out that the cause of the wildlife's unusual aggression is a strange beast of unknown origin that recently arrived on the isle, and after doing a bit of tracking, we find our culprit. A giant colibri, capable of parroting speech, swoops down to attack a smaller flying creature, and giving chase, we track it to outside the crystal cavern we explored before, and the fight is on.
Ah! What is that thing?
What is that thing? What is that thing?
just so we're clear, I wasn't startled by the beast earlier. It caught me by surprise, that's all.
Forgive me, but I failed to see a difference.
It's a pretty solid encounter, but it's blatantly there to show off Wuklammat's prowess as a fighter. She's got some pretty nice looking attacks that I know a lot of warrior players will be eager to get their hands on when Dawntrail arrives, and she helps drag us out of a couple of difficult spots. Once we take the giant bird down, Wuklammat claims she's barely limbered up, but we clearly see that she's shaken by the encounter, and just trying to act tough and show off in front of us. She's biting off more than she can chew, and I can see her not actually winning the contest when we get to it. She doesn't give off leader vibes at all, but I find her quite endearing. She's a much needed, more lively type of character and sort of reminds me of Ida, only much more charismatic. We didn't quite finish the colibri off, however, and as it rears up for another attack, Krile comes out of nowhere to take it down.
Leave this to me!
It turns out that ever since the final days, she's been honing her craft as a pictomancer, taking up the art, literally, of the Archon realm. Speaking of realm, please let her show up in Dawntrail. I would kill for more Final Fantasy VI character representation. So Krile wants to do more than just sit on the sidelines and cheer us on, and this means we'll actually get to fight alongside her in the next expansion. I'm really looking forward to it, even if I plan to play through the story as Pictomancer myself, which means there'll be a bit of an overlap. Oh well, the more the merrier, I guess. Back in Sharlayan, our party celebrates victory with a feast of what I assume to be the Colibri's meat, among other things. Turns out that Harnish cuisine has reached the city, after Zero's incredibly spicy curry proved a hit back in Radz at Han. In another of her show-off moments, Wuklammat chows down and it proves a bit too spicy for her to handle.
It's not like we don't have spicy food in Tural, too. It's nothing I can't handle.
I think that's a part of why I like her. It reminds me of an old friend of mine who tried to show off to some girl that he liked by ordering the hottest curry on the menu on a night out. I have never seen somebody sweat so much, the poor sod. We learn a bit more about Tural from Wuklammat. 80 years ago, the reigning Dawn Servant unified Tural's warring people and founded the nation of Tuliolol. Ever since then, peace has reigned over the land. Wuklammat wants our help in winning this contest because one of the other three claimants to the throne sees the fall of the Garlean Empire as an opportunity to invade. Not wanting to risk plunging the world into another war, we've got to do all we can to ensure this person doesn't win. We agree to help Wuklammat and make our preparations to head west, to the New World. G'raha brings Alphinaud and Alisei into the fold, and opts to stay behind to look after the students of Baldesion so Krile can come with us. While our group, comprising of Wuklammat, the twins and Krile, make our preparations, we see Estinian arriving at the port of Limsa Lominsa, simply travelling the world. Coincidentally, he's heading west himself. Meanwhile, Thancred and Urianger have received a petition for aid of their own, and make for Tural, claiming that they'll be competing with us when we arrive. So the stage is set for our next big adventure, and I can't wait to see what's next. I've actually been trying to avoid spoilers since the FanFest reveals, but I'm super excited to see what Tural has in store for us. I really want to try Pictomancer out and see what Solution 9 is all about. Part of me really wants to play through Final Fantasy XIV's story soon because of the new Alliance raid being based on it, as well as it being one of the two mainline games I've never played. Do I make a video on that when I get round to it? You guys will have to let me know. Thank you for watching. This whole series has been a great refresher on 14's amazing story and I've loved almost every minute of it. I know I've been overly harsh on a lot of things and that some of my opinions, especially regarding Stormblood, have resulted in some, shall we say, passionate responses, but the overall response to this series so far has been amazing. I'm recording this last bit of voiceover the day after the Shadowbringers video came out, and seeing so many of you excited for each new video I put out really puts a smile on my face. It's validating knowing that you guys enjoy this sort of thing, and it's really motivating me to put out more videos like this. I've still got plenty of Final Fantasy XIV content planned for the future, including a spoiler-free review of Dawntrail and a longer look at its story later on, along with whatever side content that ends up grabbing my attention. There's also a couple of projects swimming around in the back of my mind that involve 14 and some other related games, one of which I don't think anyone's done on YouTube yet. That's going to take quite some time to put together though, so for the immediate future look out for more 14 content and maybe other Final Fantasy videos in the coming months. The next two videos will be on Dawntrail as I plan on spending quite a bit of time with the new expansion. I hope you guys have a great time with it as well, and don't forget to hit that like button, consider subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments what you hope to see in Dawntrail and future expansions. Thanks again for all of your support, and I'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.